The Heartless Alpha, a Wolf Romance Fantasy Audiobook. Chapter 1. The Shadow Forest had always been a place of silence, but tonight it was alive. The trees, their gnarled limbs like clawed fingers, groaned under the weight of an unseen force. Whispers weaved through the fog, too faint to grasp but sharp enough to prickle the skin. Cane Thornriver crouched low behind the trunk of a decaying tree, his ears tuned to the forest's unnatural symphony. Around him, his warriors formed a loose circle, their silver eyes glowing faintly in the light of the blood moon. "Move with care," Cane growled, his voice a blade cutting through the tension. "These rogues don't strike unless they think they have the upper hand." The pack's beta, Ronan, shot him a wary look. "They've been growing bolder. This isn't just about territory anymore." Cane didn't reply. His focus was on the shadows ahead, where the fog seemed to twist and wreathe as though alive. The blood moon hung heavy above them, casting its crimson glow over the forest floor. Cane didn't trust it. The moon had always been their guide, their goddess's silent promise of order. Tonight it felt like a warning. The attack came without a sound. One moment the forest was alive with whispers, the next it exploded into chaos. Rogues burst from the fog, their fangs gleaming and their growls ripping through the stillness. Cane was on his feet in an instant, his claws tearing through the first wolf that lunged at him. The clearing became a blur of snarls and flashes of silver fur. Cane moved like a force of nature, his strength and precision unmatched. Around him, his warriors held their own, but the rogues fought with a desperation that bordered on madness. "Cane." Ronan's voice cut through the noise. Cane turned just in time to see a rogue charging toward him, its eyes wild and red with bloodlust. He met the wolf head-on, his claws raking across its side and sending it crashing into a tree. But even as the rogue fell, Cane felt it a presence, a cold, creeping sensation that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It emerged from the fog like a nightmare made flesh. The figure was wolf-like but wrong, its form shifting and flickering as though it couldn't fully take shape. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its voice was a low, haunting echo. "Alpha Thornriver," it said, the words slithering into Cane's mind rather than his ears. "You've made a grave mistake." Cane stood his ground, his claws flexing. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, the movement too smooth to be natural. "I am your truth," it whispered. "Your fate. The shadow born of your bloodline's sins." Cane's breath came faster, his heart pounding against his ribs. "You're nothing but a rogue spirit," he growled. "A trick of the forest." The shadow chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down Cane's spine. "Do you think rejecting her would come without cost? You have awakened me, Alpha. The curse stirs, and your time runs short." The shadow surged forward, its form growing larger, more menacing. Cane braced himself, but the creature didn't attack. Instead, it loomed over him, its voice dropping to a whisper. "She is the key," it said. "The bond you fear is the only thing that can save you. Reject her again, and you will lose everything: your pack, your power, your very soul." Cane lashed out, his claws slicing through the air, but the shadow vanished, dissipating like smoke. "Cane." Ronan's voice dragged him back to the present. The rogues were retreating, their wild howls fading into the distance. The clearing was littered with the wounded, and the air was thick with the scent of blood. Cane wiped his claws on his tunic, his jaw tightening. He could still feel the shadow's presence, its words clawing at the edges of his mind. The Alpha's keep was cold, its stone walls offering little comfort. Cane paced his chambers, his claws clinking softly against the floor. The shadow's warning echoed in his head. "She is the key." Cane shook his head, growling low in his throat. He didn't have time for riddles. The pack needed strength, not bonds. His fated mate, Arden Mistvale, was nothing but a distraction, a weakness he couldn't afford. But as he stared out the window at the blood moon, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was right, and that terrified him. The Alpha's keep loomed on the horizon, a fortress of stone and silence. Its jagged silhouette cut against the blood moon like a wolf's bared teeth, standing as cold and unyielding as the man who ruled it. Cain Thornriver pushed through the heavy oak doors, his blood-smeared tunic clinging to his chest. He barely noticed the low murmurs of the warriors gathered in the hall as he strode past. Their unease clung to the air like smoke, thick, suffocating, inescapable. The doors to his private chambers groaned shut behind him, muffling the voices and the weight of their judgment. The room was sparse, austere, a reflection of the man himself. A single table, a wolf pelt rug, and a window overlooking the courtyard where the pack trained were all it offered. Cain poured water into a basin and scrubbed the blood from his hands, watching it swirl crimson before disappearing. But the shadows didn't leave him. The door opened without a knock. Only one man dared such insolence. Ronan Blackthorn, Cain's beta, stepped inside. His face was drawn, the lines of worry deepened by the flickering torchlight. "You're losing them?" Ronan said, his voice sharp and unrelenting. Cain didn't turn. He braced his hands on the edge of the table, staring down at the map of the territory spread across its surface. "The rogues won't dare attack again tonight." "It's not the rogues I'm talking about," Ronan shot back. "It's the pack. They're restless. You rejected your fated mate, and now this curse." "There is no curse," Cain snapped, his voice low but heavy enough to make the air feel thicker. He turned to face Ronan, his eyes cold steel. "There are only wolves too weak to follow an alpha who won't coddle them." Ronan held his gaze, unflinching. "You think this is about strength. You stood in the moonlit clearing and spat on the bond the Moon Queen blessed. You think there's no cost to that." "The cost would have been greater had I accepted," Cain said, his tone clipped. "A mate is a weakness. A distraction. I won't let this pack fall because of some romantic tradition." Ronan sighed and crossed the room, planting his hands on the edge of the table opposite Cain. "You're stubborn. I'll give you that. But if you keep ignoring the bond, this pack will crumble from within before the rogues even get the chance to tear it apart." Cain didn't reply. His gaze drifted to the window, where the courtyard stretched out beneath the glow of the blood moon. Wolves trained below, their forms blurred by the frosty pane, their movements slow and weary. He had seen the doubt creeping into their eyes, the murmurs behind their bows of deference. The whispers of the shadow mate still lingered in his ears, haunting him like a memory that wasn't his own. His jaw tightened. "Do you know what happens to a leader who lets himself be ruled by his emotions, Ronan?" he asked, his voice cold as the wind that swept through the valley. "He becomes prey. My father made that mistake, and it cost him his life. And if you keep shutting out the bond, Cain, it'll cost you everything else," Ronan said, softer now. "You can't lead a fractured pack." Cain turned back to the map. "Then I'll make them whole again, without a mate." When Ronan finally left, Cain sat alone at the window, the light from the moon casting long shadows across the room. His reflection stared back at him, eyes dark with a weight he refused to name. He thought of the voice in the forest, the shadow that had loomed over him, and whispered his name like it knew him better than he knew himself. "You have awakened me, Alpha. The curse stirs, and your time runs short." Cain clenched his fists, his claws biting into his palms. He had always believed in the strength of his bloodline, in the legacy of the Thornriver name. But now, staring into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the very blood in his veins was a noose tightening around his neck. His gaze dropped to the courtyard once more, to the warriors moving like ghosts below. If they doubted him, if they feared the whispers of curses and mates, then he would bury those doubts beneath the weight of his power. He wouldn't let the past dictate his future, and he wouldn't let love be the weakness that destroyed him. The Silver Fang Keep wasn't welcoming. It wasn't meant to be. The walls were rough-hewn stone, the air sharp with the tang of blood and earth, and the wolves that moved through the courtyard were as cold and calculating as their alpha. Arden Mistvale stood at the gates, her green eyes scanning the scene with quiet resolve, her pack slung over one shoulder. She didn't flinch as the warriors cast her sideways glances, their suspicion as tangible as the frost in the air. She'd been summoned to heal, not to make friends, and that suited her just fine. Inside the keep, the murmur of her arrival spread like wildfire. Wolves in the warriors' hall paused their whispered conversations to watch as Arden moved through the narrow corridors, her footsteps light but purposeful. Her presence didn't just stir curiosity, it sparked unease. Outsiders were a rarity, and one with ties to the Moon Queen. That was enough to make even the bravest wolves bristle. "Who is she?" one warrior muttered under his breath. "A healer," another replied, his tone laced with doubt. "Or so they say. She's here because of the curse," a third said, quieter. "You can feel it in the air." Arden ignored the whispers, keeping her focus on the task ahead. She wasn't here to prove herself to them. She was here to fulfill her duty, no matter how unwelcome her presence might be. The den was darker than she'd expected, its walls lined with pelts and rough shelves cluttered with salves and herbs. The injured wolves lay in neat rows on the floor, their breathing shallow, their wounds wrapped hastily in cloth. Arden knelt beside the nearest warrior, her fingers brushing over the torn flesh of his shoulder. The wound was deep but clean evidence of a rogue's claws. She reached into her pack, pulling out a jar of crushed moonflower petals. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice low and steady. The wolf winced but didn't argue. As Arden worked, the faint glow of the moonflower balm spread across the wound, knitting the flesh back together with an almost imperceptible shimmer. The warriors who watched from the shadows exchanged uneasy glances. "It's the Moon Queen's magic," one whispered. Arden glanced up but said nothing. The truth was more complicated than they could imagine, and she wasn't in the mood to explain herself to wolves who'd already made up their minds about her. She felt his presence before she saw him. The air in the den shifted, heavy with authority, and something darker, something that made the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Cain Thornriver entered without ceremony, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his gray eyes scanning the room with cold precision. The injured wolves stiffened, their postures reflexively straightening despite their wounds. "You're the healer," he said, his tone more statement than question. Arden stood slowly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And you're the alpha." The corner of his mouth twitched, but it wasn't a smile. "We don't often bring outsiders into the pack. You should consider that a privilege." She tilted her head, her expression calm but unyielding. "I don't need your approval to do my job." The room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, their gazes locked, her green eyes steady and sharp, his gray ones cold but searching. Cain felt the pull immediately, the same electric hum he'd felt in the forest when the shadow had whispered of bonds and curses. He didn't like it. "You'll treat the wounded and stay out of the way," he said finally. His voice clipped. Arden raised an eyebrow but didn't reply. Instead, she turned back to her patient, her hands steady as she applied more balm to the wolf's side. Cain lingered for a moment longer, his presence a storm cloud at the edge of the room, before he turned and left without another word. As the door swung shut, the tension in the room eased, but Arden's thoughts were far from calm. She'd sensed something in Cain, something beneath the cold exterior and sharp commands. Pain, regret, fear. It was none of her business. At least, that's what she told herself. But as she moved to the next patient, the whispers of the Moon Queen began to stir in her mind, soft and distant like a song carried on the wind. Later that night, Arden stood in the courtyard, the blood moon casting its crimson light over the stones. The keep was silent, the wolves asleep or licking their wounds in private. She closed her eyes, letting the cold air fill her lungs, letting the whispers of the Moon Queen grow louder. "He rejects what he fears most," the voice said, its tone soft but commanding. "But rejection does not sever the bond, it only strengthens the curse." Images flashed through her mind, a shadowy forest, a wolf with burning eyes, the alpha standing alone at the edge of a cliff. The weight of the vision pressed down on her, its meaning as clear as the stars above. Cain Thornriver might have rejected her, but their fates were tied. And if he didn't confront the bond, the curse would destroy them both. As the blood moon sank lower in the sky, Arden opened her eyes, her resolve hardening like steel. She didn't ask for this bond, but she wouldn't let the curse win. Not while she still had a chance to stop it. Chapter 2. The moonlit clearing lay silent under the watchful gaze of the full moon. Its light bathed the glade in silver, turning the moss-covered stones and swaying grasses into something ethereal. The wolves of the Silver Fang pack stood in a circle, their heads bowed in reverence as the elders chanted low and steady, their voices weaving into the hum of the night. Arden Mistveil stood on the edge of the circle, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could feel the pack's unease radiating through the clearing. The tension hung thick in the air, charged and waiting, like the seconds before a lightning strike. This was her first ritual with the pack, and she could already tell it wouldn't end as anyone expected. The elders' chanting grew louder, their voices rising like a tide. The wolves lifted their heads, their silver eyes reflecting the light of the moon. Arden could feel the pull of the Moon Queen's presence, distant but powerful, a thread tying them all together. She closed her eyes, her breathing steady, and reached out with her senses, hoping for some sign of the goddess's blessing. Then it happened. The ground beneath her feet trembled, so faint at first it could have been her imagination. But it wasn't. The tremor grew, spreading through the clearing like a living thing. Gasps rippled through the circle as the earth cracked open, jagged lines snaking outward from the center of the glade. A cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a sound that made Arden's stomach drop. A whisper not loud, but deep, rumbling beneath the surface of reality. The words were impossible to make out, but the meaning was clear. Something ancient and angry had stirred. Dark energy rippled through the air, a black mist curling out of the cracks in the ground. It snaked through the clearing, brushing against the wolves and sending shivers down their spines. Arden's fingers tightened around the pouch of moonflower balm at her hip, but she knew no herb would stop whatever this was. The chanting faltered, and the circle broke. Cain Thornriver stepped into the center of the clearing, his presence commanding as always. His voice cut through the rising panic like a blade. "Stay calm. This is nothing more than a shift in the earth. A coincidence." The pack didn't look convinced. Neither did Arden. "It's not a coincidence," she said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, but her eyes darted to the dark mist still lingering at the edges of the clearing. "This is the curse." Cain turned to her, his expression cold and unyielding. "You think every shadow is a sign of the curse. This is superstition, nothing more." Arden's frustration bubbled to the surface. "You felt it, didn't you? The tremor, the whisper this wasn't just the earth moving. The Moon Queen was trying to warn us." "The Moon Queen," Cain said, his voice laced with sarcasm, "has better things to do than send whispers into the dirt." The pack murmured uneasily, their eyes darting between Arden and Cain. The cracks in the ground glowed faintly now, the mist dissipating but leaving behind an air of dread that no one could ignore. As the wolves began to disperse, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke, Arden followed Cain out of the clearing. His stride was purposeful, his posture rigid. She quickened her pace, matching his steps until she was beside him. "You're ignoring the truth," she said, her voice firm. Cain didn't stop walking. "The truth is that fear weakens a pack. If I start chasing shadows, they'll lose faith in me, and in themselves. This isn't about fear, it's about survival," Arden pressed. "You can't lead them if you refuse to face what's right in front of you." Cain stopped abruptly, turning to face her. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face, making his gray eyes gleam like steel. "And what would you have me do, Arden? Call a meeting and tell them the big bad curse is coming to get us? You think that's going to hold this pack together?" His tone was sharp, but Arden refused to back down. "I think admitting the truth is better than letting it destroy us from the inside out. You can't fight something you won't even acknowledge." Cain's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. For a moment, the tension between them was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken challenges. "You don't believe me," Arden said quietly, her voice losing some of its edge. But you will. Whatever's happening here, it's not done. And if you keep ignoring it, it's going to consume us all. Kane didn't respond. He turned away from her, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the blood moon hung low, its crimson glow casting long shadows over the trees. The whispers from the clearing still echoed in his mind, low and insistent. The curse stirs, and your time runs short. He clenched his fists, his claws biting into his palms. He wouldn't let the pack see his doubt. He wouldn't let anyone, especially Arden, think he wasn't in control. But as he stood there, staring into the night, a small crack formed in his resolve, the kind of crack that could grow, given time. Back in the keep, Arden sat alone in the healing den, the faint scent of moonflowers filling the air. She closed her eyes, letting the silence settle around her. And then, just as she began to drift into sleep, she heard it, the Moon Queen's voice, soft and distant, weaving through her mind like a thread of light. The bond was not made to be broken, the voice whispered. If he denies it, the curse will grow. And when it consumes him, it will consume you all. Arden's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. The Moon Queen's warning was clear. Kane's denial wouldn't just doom him. It would doom them all. The warrior's hall was quieter than usual, its usual raucous energy dampened by the tension that had been gnawing at the Silverfang pack for weeks. Wolves sat around the long wooden tables, their voices low, their eyes darting toward the door, as if expecting some unseen force to burst through at any moment. Kane Thornriver stood at the head of the room, his hands braced against the table, staring down at a map of the surrounding territory. His beta Ronin leaned against the wall nearby, his arms crossed, his sharp gaze scanning the room. The pack was restless. Whispers of the curse had spread like wildfire after the ritual in the moonlit clearing. They didn't speak of it outright, but Kane could feel the unease in their glances, in the way their words faltered when he walked past. I need eyes on the northern ridge, Kane said, his voice sharp. If the rogues are planning something, that's where they'll strike next. Ronan nodded but didn't move. His gaze had shifted to the door, his expression suddenly alert. Kane followed his line of sight just as the doors to the hall creaked open, revealing a figure swathed in a dark cloak. Sable Evenstar stepped into the hall, like a shadow slipping through the cracks of reality. Her cloak trailed behind her, the edges of the fabric embroidered with silver thread that caught the torchlight. Her eyes, pale as moonlight, swept across the room, and a chill settled over the hall. The wolves froze, their murmurs falling into silence. Sable's presence carried a weight that couldn't be ignored, a force that demanded attention without a single word. Kane straightened, his jaw tightening. Sable, he said, his voice even. We weren't expecting you. She smiled faintly, a curve of the lips that held no warmth. Prophecies rarely wait for invitations. The room seemed to shrink around her as she moved to the center of the hall, her footsteps silent against the stone floor. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over the wolves before settling on Kane. The curse, she said, her voice soft but clear, has awakened. The room was utterly still. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Sable lifted her hands, palms facing upward, as though offering the weight of her words to the room. The bond you rejected, Alpha Thornriver, was not just a union blessed by the Moon Queen. It was a tether, a key to keeping the darkness at bay. Kane's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The shadow mate, Sable continued, her gaze unflinching, is no longer a whisper in the forest. It is awake, and it will consume you, your pack, and everything you hold dear, unless the bond is fulfilled. A murmur rippled through the wolves. Kane slammed his hand down on the table, silencing them. I won't be manipulated by riddles and half-truths, he said, his voice cold. You're feeding their fear, Sable. You want them to believe this curse is real, so they'll look to you for answers. Sable's expression didn't change. You can deny it all you want, Alpha. But the bond you fear is the only thing that can save you. Her pale eyes flicked to Arden, who had been standing near the back of the room, watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and dread. And you, healer, Sable said, her voice softer now, are more entwined in this than you realize. Arden stiffened, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. What do you mean? The bloodline of Solara flows through your veins, Sable said. Her curse ties you to the shadow mate, as surely as it binds him. She gestured toward Cain. The two of you are the fulcrum on which this curse balances. You will either break it together or doom us all. Cain's laugh was sharp and humorless, cutting through the tension like a blade. You think I'm going to base the survival of my pack on some ancient myth and a bond I never wanted? This isn't about what you want, Sable said, her tone as steady as stone. This is about what is necessary. Cain shook his head, his anger barely contained. The pack needs strength, not prophecies. And I won't risk everything on the word of a seer who thrives on fear. The wolves around him exchanged uneasy glances, their doubt palpable. Sable tilted her head slightly, her pale eyes unreadable. You think rejecting her makes you strong, she said quietly. But it is the act of rejection that has made you weak. The shadow mate will not stop until it has consumed you, and when it does, your pack will fall. Cain's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't reply. Sable turned to Arden, her gaze piercing. You've felt it, haven't you? The whispers. The weight of the bond. Arden swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had felt it since the ritual. The connection to Cain had grown stronger, more insistent. The Moon Queen's voice had lingered in her thoughts, a quiet presence that refused to be ignored. What am I supposed to do? She asked, her voice low but steady. Find the strength he refuses to acknowledge, Sable said. And when the time comes, you will have to choose his survival or your own. The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over them like a shroud. Sable's gaze swept the room one final time before she turned toward the door. The blood moon rises again soon, she said over her shoulder. And with it, the shadow mate will grow stronger. If you do nothing, Alpha Thorn River, it will be your undoing. She disappeared into the night, leaving behind a room filled with tension so thick it was suffocating. Cain stood motionless, his jaw clenched, his mind racing. The wolves looked to him for reassurance, but he had none to give. Instead, he turned and walked out of the hall, his steps heavy with the weight of what he refused to believe. Arden watched him go, her heart pounding. For the first time, she felt the full gravity of her role in the pack's fate. Sable's prophecy wasn't just about Cain. It was about her, too, and the choice she would eventually have to make. As the door closed behind Cain, Arden glanced at the warriors around her, their fear written plainly on their faces. She didn't blame them. After all, she was afraid too, but fear wouldn't stop the curse, and it wouldn't stop the shadow mate. The hostility in the air was almost palpable, pressing down on Arden Mistvale as she moved through the narrow corridors of the Alpha's keep. Wolves paused in their conversations as she passed, their gazes cold, their whispers sharp enough to cut. It didn't matter that she was here to help. To them, she was an outsider, a reminder of the curse that had shaken their foundation. She kept her chin high, her steps steady. If she let them see her falter, it would only make things worse. The tension reached its boiling point in the courtyard. Arden had barely stepped into the open air when a low growl caught her attention. She turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered warrior approaching her, his lips curled back to reveal sharp teeth. You think you can just walk in here and fix everything? He snarled. We don't need you. We don't need your magic. Arden's fingers tightened around the strap of her satchel, but her voice was calm when she replied. I didn't come here to fix everything. I came to help. Help? Another wolf sneered, stepping out of the shadows. All you've brought us is trouble. The curse didn't stir until you showed up. Arden met his gaze steadily, refusing to let his words sink in. The curse didn't stir because of me. It stirred because of the choices your Alpha made. The growl that rippled through the group was low and menacing, but before anyone could step closer, a sharp whistle cut through the tension. Ash, a young warrior with a lean frame and sharp eyes, approached from the training grounds, his expression tight with warning. Back off, Ash said, stepping between Arden and the others. His voice was firm but lacked the bite of aggression. "She's here to help. If you've got a problem with that, take it up with the alpha." The wolves grumbled but eventually dispersed, their glares lingering a moment longer before they returned to their duties. "You've got a way of making friends, don't you?" Ash said, glancing over his shoulder at Arden. There was no mockery in his tone, only a quiet observation. The healing den was tucked into the eastern wing of the keep, away from the constant movement of the pack. Arden had made it her sanctuary, a space where the whispers of suspicion couldn't reach her. The earthy scent of herbs filled the air, calming her nerves as she set her satchel on the wooden table and began unpacking. She was halfway through sorting dried moonflower petals when the door creaked open. Arden glanced up to see Ash leaning against the frame, his arms crossed. A faint bruise was beginning to form on his jaw, evidence of a recent training bout. "Need something?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Figured I'd make sure you weren't sharpening your claws after what happened out there," Ash said with a faint smirk. "You held your ground, though. Most outsiders would have run." "I'm not most outsiders," Arden replied, turning her attention back to her work. Ash stepped inside, his gaze scanning the room. "Why are you here, really? You could have stayed with your own pack, wherever that is. Why come to a place where everyone's looking at you like you're the next disaster waiting to happen?" Arden paused, her hands hovering over a jar of salve. "Because someone has to help, and whether they want to admit it or not, they need me." The hours passed in a quiet rhythm. Arden lost herself in the familiar motions of grinding herbs, mixing salves and wrapping bandages. The injured wolves trickled in one by one, some offering terse words of thanks, others silent but grudgingly cooperative. Ash stayed nearby, helping her organize supplies and occasionally asking questions about her methods. Despite his sharp tongue, he seemed genuinely interested, and Arden found herself relaxing in his presence. "You're not bad at this," Ash said, watching as she applied a poultice to a warrior's shoulder. "Better than the last healer we had, anyway. He just dumped whiskey on everything and called it a day." Arden smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a compliment." "You should," Ash said, his tone light but his expression serious. "They'll come around eventually? They're just scared." "And you?" Arden asked, glancing at him. "Are you scared?" Ash hesitated, then shrugged. "Of the curse?" "Yeah, of you, not so much. You don't seem the type to bring down a pack just by walking through the door." "Good to know," Arden said, her voice dry but tinged with warmth. By the time the last wolf had left, the tension in Arden's shoulders had eased. She leaned back against the wall, her hands stained with salve and her body aching from the long day. Ash was still there, sweeping the floor with a makeshift broom. "You didn't have to stay," Arden said. "Figured you could use the company," Ash replied. He glanced at her, his smirk softening into something almost genuine. "Besides, someone's got to keep an eye on you. Can't have you cursing the whole pack while no one's looking." Arden chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Thanks, Ash." "Anytime," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sincere. As the din grew quiet, Arden allowed herself a moment to breathe. The hostility of the pack still weighed on her, but for the first time she felt a flicker of hope. Not everyone was against her, and maybe, just maybe, she could prove to them and to herself that she had a place here. The Moon Queen's warning echoed in the back of her mind, a soft but steady reminder of the storm still to come. But for now, Arden focused on what she could control: her work, her resolve, and the small but growing trust of those willing to see past their fear. The night was heavy, a blanket of silence draped over the Silverfang keep. The blood moon hung low, its crimson light seeping through the cracks in the shutters of the healing den. Arden Mistvale sat cross-legged on the floor, her hands resting on her knees, her breathing steady but shallow. The events of the day lingered in her mind like Smoke Sable's prophecy, the pack's hostility, Kane's cold defiance. The moonflowers she'd crushed earlier still filled the room with their faint, soothing scent. But it wasn't enough to drown out the unease curling in her chest. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, hoping for the kind of dreamless sleep that rarely came to her anymore. Instead, the visions came. Arden found herself standing in a vast, shadowed forest. The air was thick, and the trees loomed impossibly high, their gnarled branches curling like claws against a starless sky. A pale mist drifted along the ground, curling around her ankles as she moved forward. She didn't recognize this place, but it felt familiar. The pull of something ancient and powerful tugged at her chest, guiding her steps. Her heartbeat quickened as she saw a figure emerge from the mist, a tall, regal wolf with a shimmering silver pelt and eyes that burned like embers. "Solara," Arden whispered, the name slipping from her lips as though it had been waiting there all along. The wolf's form shifted, and in her place stood a woman. Her beauty was sharp, almost otherworldly, but her eyes held a sorrow so deep it seemed to echo in the air around her. She was dressed in flowing silver robes that shimmered with each movement, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders like a river of shadows. "You know my name," Solara said, her voice soft but edged with something that made Arden shiver. "And I know yours, Arden Mistvale, daughter of my bloodline, heir to my mistakes." "I don't understand," Arden said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "Why am I here?" "You are here because of the curse," Solara replied, her tone as calm as the surface of a frozen lake. "The curse I placed on Cain's bloodline. The curse that ties you to him." Arden's brows furrowed. "Why me? I didn't ask for this." Solara's expression softened, but the sadness in her eyes deepened. "No one asks for the weight of destiny, and yet it finds us all the same." She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, as though the air itself bent to her will. "When I was betrayed, my heart shattered. The bond that was meant to protect me became my ruin. In my grief, I summoned the Shadow Wolf, binding it to the Thorn River bloodline as punishment for their betrayal. But the curse grew beyond my control. It became something darker, something even I could not undo." Arden's breath hitched. "You're saying Cain's rejection awakened it?" "Yes," Solara said, her gaze piercing. "And now it will consume him." Unless what?" Arden pressed, desperation creeping into her voice. Solara's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Unless the bond is fulfilled. Only an act of true love, selfless, unyielding, can break the curse. The bond you share with Cain is not just a burden, Arden. It is the key." Arden's hands clenched at her sides. "He doesn't want the bond. He's made that very clear." Solara's eyes darkened, and for a moment the air grew colder. "Do not mistake his fear for hatred. Cain carries the weight of his bloodline's sins, but he cannot carry it alone. You were chosen because you have the strength to see what he cannot." Arden's chest tightened, the weight of Solara's words pressing down on her like a physical force. "And if I can't do this, if I fail, then the curse will consume not just him, but you, the pack, and all who follow." Solara's voice was steady, unrelenting. "The shadow mate will rise, and it will destroy everything in its path." As the mist began to swirl around Solara, her form growing fainter, she reached out and touched Arden's hand. The touch burned not with pain, but with a searing heat that left a mark behind. Arden looked down to see a faint, glowing symbol etched into her palm, a crescent moon entwined with a wolf's claw. "This mark binds you to him," Solara said, her voice fading as her form dissolved into the mist. "It is a reminder of what must be done. The Moon Queen has chosen you, Arden Mistvale. Do not fail her." The mist swallowed Solara whole, leaving Arden alone in the shadowed forest. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding in her ears. The mark on her palm glowed faintly, a constant reminder of the bond she couldn't escape. Arden jolted awake, her body slick with sweat despite the chill in the air. The healing den was quiet, the faint glow of the moonflower petals casting soft light over the room. She sat up, her chest heaving, and looked down at her palm. The mark was still there. She traced the lines with her fingertips, the reality of it settling in like a stone in her gut. There was no escaping this, no denying it. Whatever her role in this curse, it was deeper than she had imagined. The Moon Queen's voice echoed faintly in her mind, soft and distant but unmistakable, The bond was not made to be broken. Arden's resolve hardened. She didn't know how she would break the curse, but one thing was clear: her connection to Cain was more than fate. It was a lifeline. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, he needed her. As the first light of dawn crept into the den, Arden tightened her jaw, her fingers brushing over the mark again. She would find a way to save the pack, to save Cain, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Chapter 3. The stone market sprawled across the valley floor like a beast that refused to sleep. A maze of tents and wooden stalls formed the neutral ground where wolves from every pack, and some with no pack at all, traded goods, secrets, and alliances in the thin veil of civility. The air was thick with the scent of spices, iron, and unspoken tension. Arden Misfell tugged her hood lower, her sharp green eyes darting through the crowd as she followed Ronan Blackthorn's broad shoulders. His gait was purposeful, his posture rigid, and his silence brimming with unspoken mistrust. She'd known from the start that Ronan didn't trust her. Now, after everything that had happened, his wariness had turned into something darker. "Keep close," Ronan muttered, his voice low enough to disappear beneath the noise of the market. "The rogues don't follow rules here." "I can handle myself," Arden replied, her tone just as quiet but with a sharper edge. Ronan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The tension between them had grown thick enough to cut. They stopped near a stall where a burly merchant hawked furs and leather goods, his voice booming over the chatter. Ronan exchanged terse words with another wolf, while Arden lingered by a stack of crates, her ears catching fragments of conversation from the nearby alley. It was the voices that stopped her, a pair of low, conspiratorial tones that made the fine hairs on the back of her neck rise. "Solara's bloodline. It's alive and kicking in Silverfang," one voice said, laced with derision. Arden froze, her pulse quickening. She leaned closer to the crates, her breath held tight in her chest. "She doesn't even know the full story," the second voice replied. "Her mother kept the truth from her. But if she figures it out, Thornriver's pack is as good as finished." The first voice snorted. "Cain's too blind to see it. He doesn't realize she's tied to the curse as much as he is." Arden's heart pounded in her ears. She gripped the edge of the crate, her mind racing. Her mother? The curse? The words hit her like stones, each one heavier than the last. The voices continued, but she didn't hear the rest. The blood roared too loud in her ears, drowning out everything but the sinking realization that the curse wasn't just something she'd inherited, it was something her mother had helped create. "Arden," Ronan's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and impatient. She turned to see him standing a few feet away, his arms crossed and his expression as unreadable as stone. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," she said quickly, her voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside her. Ronan's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, his gaze flicking to the alley where the voices had come from. "You were listening to someone?" Arden shook her head, pulling her hood tighter. "It was nothing important." "It didn't look like nothing," Ronan said, his voice low but biting. "If you're hiding something." "I'm not," Arden snapped, her tone sharper than she intended. She straightened her posture, meeting his gaze with unflinching defiance. "Not that you'd believe me even if I was." Ronan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The tension between them was almost unbearable, the unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air. As they walked back through the market, the silence between them was thick with mistrust. Arden's mind raced, replaying the words she'd overheard, trying to make sense of what they meant. Solara's bloodline, her mother's role in the curse. How much had been kept from her? Ronan's voice broke through her thoughts. "What did you hear?" "Nothing you need to worry about," Arden replied, her tone clipped. Ronan stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His gray eyes were hard as steel, his expression dark. "You've been keeping secrets since the moment you arrived," he said. "And now, after everything, you're still holding back? How do you expect anyone to trust you?" "Trust works both ways," Arden shot back. "You don't trust me because you don't want to. No matter what I do, you've already decided I'm the enemy." "Maybe I should," Ronan muttered under his breath. but Arden heard him loud and clear. She clenched her fists, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "If you've got something to say, Ronan, say it." He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. "I think you're a liability. And if Kane can't see that, then maybe he's not fit to lead this pack." The words hit Arden like a blow, but she didn't flinch. "If you think undermining him will make things better, you're wrong. You'll only make this worse." Ronan didn't reply. Instead, he turned and walked away, his silence more damning than anything he could have said. Ronan's steps led him to the edge of the market, where the shadows grew longer, and the noise of the crowd faded into an eerie stillness. A figure waited for him there, her arms crossed and her expression sharp as a blade. Arya, the rival alpha, smirked as he approached. "You're late." "I'm here," Ronan said, his voice curt. "And?" Arya tilted her head, her amber eyes gleaming with amusement. "Does Thornriver still have his head buried in the sand?" "He refuses to see the truth," Ronan said, his tone bitter. "The curse is tearing this pack apart, and he's too stubborn to admit it. If we wait for him to act, there won't be a pack left to save." Arya's smirk widened. "Then it's time for you to take matters into your own hands, isn't it?" Ronan didn't answer, but the flicker of agreement in his eyes was enough. Back at the keep, Arden sat alone in the healing den, the weight of what she'd overheard pressing down on her like a storm cloud. She traced the mark on her palm, the faint glow a reminder of the Moon Queen's warning, Solara's bloodline, her mother's role in the curse, and now the growing fracture within the pack. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one of shadows and betrayal. And somewhere in the distance, the shadow mate stirred, its presence growing stronger with each passing moment. Arden closed her eyes, her resolve hardening. She didn't know how, but she would find a way to stop this before it was too late. The air in the Alpha's quarters felt heavier tonight, suffused with an unnatural stillness. Kane Thornriver stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit courtyard below. The wolves who remained awake moved like shadows, their steps quick, their eyes filled with unease. They were restless, and Kane couldn't blame them. He wasn't resting either. His fingers gripped the windowsill, the cool stone grounding him as his thoughts churned. The curse. The bond. Arden. Her name scratched at the edge of his mind, an unwelcome presence he couldn't seem to shake. His jaw tightened as he forced the thought away. He wouldn't give in to the bond. He couldn't. But then, the whisper came. It slid through the air like smoke, curling around him, seeping into his ears. The voice was low, grating, and far too close. "You think you can lead them without her?" it asked, its tone mocking. "You think strength will save you?" Kane spun around, his claws instinctively extending, but the room was empty. The voice, however, lingered. "You've already failed them, Thornriver. You just don't know it yet." The world shifted around him. The stone walls of his quarters blurred, fading into a new scene that felt too vivid to be anything but real. He was standing in the middle of the courtyard now, though he hadn't moved. Around him, the pack lay in ruin. The buildings were crumbling, their edges charred and broken. Wolves as wolves lay lifeless, their bodies twisted and bloodied. At the center of the destruction stood the shadow mate. Its form was fluid, its edges flickering between wolf and shadow. Its eyes glowed an unnatural red, burning with malice. "This is your future," it hissed, its voice crawling beneath his skin. "This is what your pride has brought you." Kane clenched his fists, his claws digging into his palms. "This isn't real." "Not yet," the shadow mate said, stepping closer. "But it will be. You've already planted the seeds. Your rejection of her has sealed their fate." Kane growled low in his throat. "The bond doesn't make me a leader. Strength does." The shadow mate laughed, a hollow, grating sound that echoed in the empty courtyard. "Strength? Is that what you call it? Denying the bond isn't strength? Thornriver, it's fear, and it will be the death of you." The vision shifted again, faster this time, throwing him into another scene. Arden stood at the edge of a cliff, her back to him, the wind pulling at her hair. She turned to face him, Her green eyes filled with something he couldn't name: disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. "You think rejecting me will protect them?" she said, her voice quiet but cutting. "But you're wrong. The pack doesn't need an alpha who runs from the truth. They need someone who will face it." Cain reached for her, but the ground gave way beneath her feet. She fell, her form swallowed by the shadows below, her scream piercing the air. Cain jolted back to the present, his breathing ragged, his chest heaving. The room was still, but the shadow mate's voice lingered in his mind. The knock on his door came minutes later. Cain ignored it at first, his body still bracing for the shadows to reappear. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. "Cain," a voice called. Arden's voice. He cursed under his breath, but didn't move. The door creaked open, and Arden stepped inside, her expression a mix of concern and determination. She paused when she saw him, taking in his tense posture, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her tone lighter than her expression. Cain turned his back to her, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "What do you want, Arden?" "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, crossing her arms. "You've been pulling away from everyone. The pack is falling apart, and you're hiding up here like the world isn't burning around you." "I don't need a lecture," Cain growled. "Least of all from you." "Well, you're getting one," she shot back. "Because someone has to say it. Whatever you're dealing with, you can't do it alone. And you can't keep pretending the bond doesn't matter." Cain turned to face her then, his eyes cold, his expression hard. "The bond isn't what's going to save this pack." "And running from it is?" she countered, stepping closer. "You're so afraid of letting someone in that you're willing to let everything else fall apart." Her words hit harder than he wanted to admit. He felt the cracks forming in his resolve, but he couldn't let them widen. Not now. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You don't know what it's like to carry this weight. To have every decision you make determine whether your pack lives or dies." "You're right," Arden said, her tone softening but losing none of its intensity. "I don't know what that's like, but I do know what it's like to feel helpless. To want to make a difference but be shut out at every turn. That's what you're doing to me, Cain. You're shutting me out when I'm the one who's supposed to stand beside you." Cain stared at her, his chest tightening. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. For a moment the room was silent, the tension between them heavy but unspoken. Then Cain sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly, the fight draining out of him. "It's not that simple," he said quietly. "The curse, the shadow mate, it's all connected to the bond. And if I give in to it, I don't know what will happen." Arden stepped closer, her gaze steady. "What's worse? Facing the unknown or letting the curse destroy everything you've built?" Cain didn't answer. He couldn't. But the cracks in his heartless facade had begun to show, and Arden saw them. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice softer now. "You just have to let me in." The words hung between them, a fragile thread of connection in a sea of chaos. For the first time, Cain didn't push her away. As Arden left the room, Cain turned back to the window. The courtyard below was quiet now, the moon casting long shadows over the stones. But the vision of the shadow mate and the broken pack lingered in his mind, a chilling reminder of what could be. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that Arden was right, and that terrified him. The cracked valley was aptly named. A scar in the earth that stretched for miles, its jagged ridges and sharp cliffs looked like the aftermath of some ancient battle between gods. The valley floor was littered with boulders and dead trees, casting long shadows under the pale light of the moon. It was the kind of place that whispered danger with every gust of wind. Cain Thornriver stalked ahead of the patrol, his silver eyes scanning the shadows. His claws flexed instinctively at his sides, his senses sharp. The valley had been quiet for weeks, but his gut told him that quiet was about to shatter. Behind him, Arden Mistfell moved with practiced ease, her presence almost unnoticeable, except for the faint scent of moonflower that trailed her. She had insisted on joining the patrol, her argument firm and her gaze unyielding. "You think I'm just going to sit in the healing den while rogues tear through your pack?" she'd said. He hadn't argued. He wasn't sure if it was because he respected her resolve or because he was too tired to fight her on it. The attack came without warning. One moment, the valley was still, the only sound the wind whistling through the rocks. The next, rogues poured out from the shadows, their growls ripping through the silence like thunder. "Formation." Cain barked, his voice sharp and commanding. His warriors moved quickly, forming a defensive line as the rogues charged. Cain's claws flashed as he leapt into the fray, his movements precise and brutal. He tore through the first rogue that came at him, his strength undeniable. But for every wolf he cut down, two more seemed to take its place. From the corner of his eye he saw Arden holding her own, her movements swift and calculated. She wasn't just a healer, she was a fighter, and a damn good one at that. But the rogues were relentless. Cain turned just in time to see a massive rogue charging straight for him, its eyes wild with bloodlust. He braced himself, ready to meet the attack, but the rogue never reached him. A burst of silver light erupted between them, blinding and searing. The rogue howled, its momentum faltering as it crumpled to the ground. Cain blinked, his vision clearing just in time to see Arden standing there, her palm glowing faintly with the mark of the Moon Queen. "You're welcome," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. The battle raged on, but Cain couldn't shake what he'd just seen. Arden had saved him, the alpha who didn't trust anyone, who believed strength was all that mattered. He watched her move through the fight, her focus unwavering. Every time a wolf faltered, she was there, her touch steady, her presence commanding. When the rogues finally retreated, their howls fading into the distance, the valley fell into a tense silence. The warriors stood scattered, their breaths heavy, their bodies battered but unbroken. Cain approached Arden, his expression unreadable. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low. Arden wiped blood from her hands, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. "That was me keeping you alive," she said simply. "You're welcome again, by the way." Her words were light, but there was a weight behind them, a challenge he couldn't ignore. Cain's jaw tightened. "You've been holding back." "No," Arden said, stepping closer. "You've been blind. To me. To this bond. To everything that's right in front of you." He wanted to argue, to push back, but the truth of her words stopped him. She had saved him. She had proven her strength. And for the first time, Cain didn't know how to respond. Before Cain could speak, Ronan approached, his face tense. "Alpha," he said, his voice urgent, "we need to talk." Later, Cain growled, his attention still on Arden. "It can't wait," Ronan insisted, his eyes darting to the warriors gathering around the injured. "There's something you need to know." Cain turned to him, his patience wearing thin. "What is it, Ronan?" Ronan hesitated, but before he could answer, one of the injured warriors stumbled forward. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. "The rogues, they knew we'd be here. Someone tipped them off." The weight of the revelation hit the group like a thunderclap. Cain's eyes narrowed, his gaze snapping to Ronan. "What are you saying?" The warrior didn't answer, but the way his eyes flicked toward Ronan said everything. Cain's claws extended, his stance shifting as rage coursed through him. "Ronan, explain. Now." Ronan's lips pressed into a thin line. "I did what I had to do," he said finally, his voice tight. "You've been too distracted by the curse." By her he gestured at Arden, "to see what's happening to this pack. I made a deal with the rogues to buy us time, to keep the peace. You betrayed us." Cain snarled, his voice a low growl. "I protected the pack." Ronan shot back. "Something you've been too blind to do. You're too focused on this bond, this curse, to see what's happening around you." "I did what you couldn't." Cain moved faster than anyone could react. One moment he was standing still, the next he had Ronan pinned against a boulder, his claws digging into the beata's throat. "You sold us out," Cain growled, his voice barely human. "You put their lives, my pack's lives, in danger. I did what you wouldn't, Ronan spat, his voice strained but defiant. And maybe I was wrong. But you've been wrong, too. Kane's grip tightened, but before he could deliver the final blow, Arden stepped forward. Enough, she said, her voice firm. This isn't your fight, Kane snapped, his claws still pressing against Ronan's skin. It is if you tear your pack apart, Arden said. You want to prove you're strong? Then show them you can lead. Killing him won't fix what's broken. For a long moment, Kane didn't move. The tension crackled in the air, the weight of his fury palpable. Then, slowly he released Ronan, who collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. As the pack regrouped, Kane stood apart, his mind a storm of anger, betrayal, and something he couldn't quite name. Arden approached him, her presence grounding despite the chaos still swirling around them. You need to decide what kind of alpha you want to be, she said quietly. Because right now, this pack needs more than strength. They need trust. Kane didn't respond, but her words lingered long after she walked away. As the blood moon cast its glow over the valley, Kane knew one thing for certain. The shadow mate wasn't his only enemy. The real battle had only just begun. The healing den was quiet that night, the faint glow of moonflowers casting soft light over the rough stone walls. Arden sat cross-legged on the floor, her back resting against the table where she'd sorted herbs earlier. The events of the day replayed in her mind like a broken record, pain's rage. Ronan's betrayal, the blood on the valley floor. She couldn't shake the feeling that the storm brewing around them was far from over. The mark on her palm pulsed faintly, a soft, rhythmic beat, like a second heartbeat. Arden stared at it, tracing its crescent shape with her fingertip. She hadn't told anyone about it, not even Kane. It felt like hers alone, a secret she wasn't ready to share. The air shifted. The faint scent of moonflowers mingled with something sharper, colder. Arden's eyelids grew heavy, her breathing slowed, and the world around her faded. She was standing in the middle of a desolate plain, the sky above her a swirl of black clouds and silver light. The ground beneath her feet was cracked and dry, its surface littered with shards of obsidian that gleamed like shattered mirrors. In the distance, a single structure rose against the horizon, a tomb carved into the side of a mountain, its entrance yawning like a wolf's maw. Solara stood before it, her figure luminous against the dark landscape. Her silver robes flowed as if caught in a breeze Arden couldn't feel. Her eyes, pale and piercing, locked onto Arden's with a mix of urgency and sorrow. You're running out of time, Solara said, her voice carrying on the wind. Arden's fists clenched at her sides. What do you want from me? I'm doing everything I can. You're not looking where you need to, Solara replied. She gestured toward the tomb, her movements deliberate. The answers you seek lie here. But the journey will not be easy. Arden's gaze shifted to the tomb. The air around it seemed to shimmer with dark energy, an oppressive weight that pressed down on her chest, even from a distance. What's in there? She asked. Truth, Solara said. And pain. That's not exactly helpful, Arden muttered. Solara's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. The curse began here in this place. If you wish to break it, you must understand it. But be warned, Arden, what you find may not be what you expect. The sky above the tomb shifted, the dark clouds parting to reveal the faint glow of the moon. Its light fell on Arden like a spotlight, and with it came a voice she recognized instantly as the Moon Queen's. The bond will be tested. The truth will cut deeper than any blade. But only through the darkness can you find the light. Arden's vision blurred as the moon's glow intensified, the light swallowing everything around her. The last thing she saw was Solara's figure dissolving into the shadows, her final words echoing in the air. Find the tomb. Before the shadow mate finds you. Arden jolted awake, her chest heaving, her palms slick with sweat. The mark on her hand was glowing faintly, the light fading with each passing second, until it was nothing more than a dull outline. She pushed herself to her feet, her thoughts racing. Solara's Tom, the curse's origin, the Moon Queen's warning. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she was only just beginning to understand. There was no time to waste. The Alpha's quarters were as unwelcoming as ever, the air thick with Kane's presence. He stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense. He didn't turn as she entered, but his voice carried the weight of his frustration. "What is it now, Arden?" he asked. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "And before you say anything, no, it can't wait." Kane turned, his gray eyes sharp and cold. "You're not exactly helping your case." "Neither are you," Arden shot back. She stepped closer, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. "I had another vision." His expression darkened. "Another one of Solara's riddles." "This one wasn't a riddle," Arden said. "She showed me where we need to go. There's a tomb, a place tied to the curse. She said the answers are there." Kane's jaw tightened. "You're basing this on the word of a spirit who cursed my bloodline in the first place." "And the Moon Queen?" Arden added, her tone firm. "She spoke to me too. She said the bond will be tested and that the truth is in that tomb. Are you really going to ignore that?" Kane's silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Arden could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between his pride and the weight of everything they'd faced so far. "You expect me to drop everything and follow you into the wilderness based on a vision?" he said finally, his voice low. "Yes," Arden said, stepping even closer. "Because this isn't just about you or me. It's about the pack. The curse is growing stronger, and if we don't act now, it's going to tear everything apart." Kane's gaze held hers, his expression unreadable. The tension between them was almost unbearable, the silence stretching until Arden thought he might send her away. Then he sighed, a sound that was more frustration than resignation. "Fine," he said. "We'll go. But if this turns out to be a dead end, don't expect me to take your word for anything again." Arden nodded, relief washing over her despite his tone. "Fair enough. Ronan stays here," Kane added. "I don't trust him. And after what happened in the valley, I want eyes on him at all times." "Agreed," Arden said. She hesitated for a moment before adding, "Thank you, Kane, for trusting me." "Don't make me regret it," he replied, turning back to the window. As Arden left his quarters, the weight of the vision still pressed on her. But for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope. The journey to Solara's tomb wouldn't be easy, but it was a step forward, a chance to finally unravel the curse that had haunted them both. Outside, the moon hung low in the sky, its light casting long shadows over the keep. Arden traced the mark on her palm, her resolve hardening. Whatever awaited them in the tomb, she would face it head-on, because the bond wasn't just a burden. It was the key. Chapter 4. The deadwood marsh stretched out before them like the carcass of some long-dead beast. The trees, stripped bare and gnarled, reached skyward with crooked fingers. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant water and decay, the ground beneath their boots shifting uneasily between solid earth and treacherous muck. Kane Thornriver walked ahead, his broad shoulders tense, his movements deliberate. He didn't look back, not even when Arden Mistfell's foot slipped in the mud with a muttered curse. She caught herself on a nearby tree, her fingers curling around its brittle bark. "You could slow down, you know," Arden said, brushing mud off her tunic. Her tone was sharp, but not without a hint of humor. "Unless you're trying to lose me." Kane didn't stop. "If you can't keep up, you shouldn't have come." Arden sighed, her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "You'd like that, wouldn't you? To face this all on your own, like some tragic lone wolf." He didn't answer, but his silence said enough. The marsh grew denser as they moved deeper, the narrow paths winding like veins through the rotting landscape. The air was heavy, oppressive, and every sound seemed amplified: the distant croak of frogs, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush, the squelch of mud beneath their boots. Kane finally slowed, his sharp gaze scanning their surroundings. "We're getting close to the border. Rogues sometimes patrol this area." "Of course they do," Arden muttered, pulling her hood tighter. "It wouldn't be a proper journey without some life-threatening danger." Kane glanced over his shoulder, a flicker of amusement crossing his otherwise grim features. "Didn't realize you had a sense of humor." "There's a lot you don't realize about me," Arden shot back, meeting his gaze. Her green eyes sparkled with defiance, and for a moment, Cain thought he saw something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. He turned away, his expression hardening. "Keep your focus. We're not out of danger yet." As they pressed on, the shadows grew thicker, the trees closing in around them like skeletal sentinels. The air was cooler here, and Arden's instincts prickled with unease. "Cain," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Do you feel that?" He paused, his body going rigid as he tilted his head, listening. The marsh was silent, too silent. The usual hum of insects and distant calls of birds had vanished, replaced by a thick, unnatural quiet. Then he heard it, the faint crunch of movement, just ahead. "Rogues," Cain growled, his claws extending. He motioned for Arden to stay behind him, but she stepped forward, her eyes scanning the shadows with the precision of someone used to danger. "They're circling us," she said, her voice steady, "trying to box us in." Cain nodded, his mind already calculating. "Stay close. If they come at us, they will," Arden interrupted. Her voice was calm but resolute. "And when they do, we fight together." The first rogue struck fast, leaping out from the shadows with a snarl. Cain met it head-on, his claws slashing through the air with brutal precision. The wolf yelped, its body crumpling into the mud, but two more took its place. Arden moved with surprising grace, her dagger flashing as she blocked an attack from the side. Her movements were quick, calculated, and Cain couldn't help but notice the way she handled herself, like she'd been fighting for survival long before she'd ever set foot in his pack. "Behind you," Arden shouted. Cain spun just in time to catch another rogue mid-lunge, his claws tearing through its flank. The fight was chaotic, the marsh becoming a battlefield of mud and blood. But even in the chaos, Cain and Arden moved in sync, their actions complementing each other like pieces of a puzzle. When the last rogue fell, its body sinking into the muck, the marsh fell silent once more. Cain straightened, his chest heaving, his claws dripping with blood. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but edged with something almost like concern. Arden wiped her blade on her tunic, her breath steady. "I'm fine. You?" Cain didn't answer, but the faint nod he gave her was enough. They found a drier patch of ground to rest, the oppressive silence of the marsh broken only by the distant croak of frogs. Arden leaned against a tree, her fingers tracing the mark on her palm absent-mindedly. "Why do you always do that?" Cain asked suddenly. "Do what?" Arden replied, glancing at him. "Throw yourself into danger like you've got nothing to lose." Arden's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Because if I don't, who will?" Cain studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching hers. "You're not like anyone I've ever met. And you're not as heartless as you pretend to be," Arden said softly. He looked away, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy cloak. "You don't know me." "Not yet," she replied, her voice quiet but certain. As they rose to continue their journey, the tension between them shifted, still sharp, but no longer hostile. They moved through the marsh with renewed purpose, the looming presence of Solara's Tom drawing them forward. The deadwood marsh eventually gave way to higher ground, the air growing colder, the terrain more rugged. In the distance, the tomb rose against the horizon, its dark silhouette a stark contrast to the pale moonlight. Arden stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The sight of it filled her with equal parts dread and determination. This was where it had all begun. And this was where it would end. Cain stood beside her, his expression unreadable. But for the first time, he didn't pull away. "Let's finish this," he said. Arden nodded, her fingers brushing against the mark on her palm. Together. The tomb awaited, its secrets buried deep. And as they stepped closer, the shadows seemed to whisper promises of truth and pain. The entrance to Solara's Tom loomed before them, carved into the face of the jagged cliff like the maw of a beast waiting to swallow them whole. The air was colder here, biting at their skin, despite the stillness of the night. Arden Mistvale and Cain Thornriver stood side by side, their breaths visible in the pale moonlight. The tomb was ancient, its weathered stone etched with runes that glowed faintly, as though they were alive. Arden traced the edge of one with her fingertips, a shiver running through her. She could feel the weight of the place, the power pulsing just beneath the surface. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is where it all started." Kane didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the threshold, his jaw tight. He didn't like this. Not the tomb, not the runes, not the way the air felt heavier with every step they took closer to the truth. But he knew they couldn't turn back now. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice low. The air inside the tomb was cold and damp, the narrow passage lit only by the faint glow of the runes carved into the walls. The further they descended, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as though the weight of centuries pressed down on them. Arden walked ahead, her fingers brushing against the walls for balance. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her resolve was steady. She could feel the pull of the Moon Queen's mark on her palm, guiding her deeper into the tomb. Kane followed closely behind, his claws extended, his senses sharp. The shadows seemed to move around them, whispering secrets he couldn't quite catch. He hated this place, hated the way it made him feel like a pawn in someone else's game. They reached a chamber at the end of the passage, its walls lined with ancient carvings depicting wolves and moons, betrayal and blood. At the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, its surface etched with more glowing runes. The air was so still it felt like the world had paused, and then the room began to glow. The light grew brighter, coalescing into a figure that rose from the pedestal like smoke taking form. Solara's spirit stood before them, her silver robes flowing as though caught in an invisible wind. Her pale eyes fixed on Kane first, then Arden, her expression a mix of sorrow and something harder. "So, you've come," she said, her voice as soft and sharp as a blade wrapped in silk. Kane tensed, his claws flexing at his sides. "Solara, descendant of the Thorn River line," she said, her gaze piercing. "You carry the weight of your ancestors' sins, though you refuse to see it." Kane's jaw tightened. "I'm here to end the curse, not to talk about the past." Solara's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "The past is the curse. You cannot break it without understanding how it began." Her gaze shifted to Arden, softening slightly. "And you, daughter of my bloodline, you are the key to its undoing. But first you must confront the truth of what ties you to this place." Solara turned, her hand brushing the air. The runes on the walls flared to life, projecting images that moved like in-memories. Arden and Kane watched as the story unfolded. A powerful alpha, proud and arrogant, stood before Solara. He was Kane's ancestor, his features unmistakably similar. Solara knelt before him, her face full of hope and love, offering her bond to him. But he rejected her. The image shifted, showing the alpha turning his back on Solara, choosing another mate instead. Her pain was palpable, her cries echoing through the chamber. In her despair, she called upon the Shadow Wolf, a force born of rage and betrayal, binding it to the Thorn River bloodline. "I curse them," Solara said, her voice heavy with regret. "I curse them to know the pain of rejection, to suffer the consequences of their arrogance. But I didn't foresee how deeply the curse would root itself. The Shadow Wolf grew beyond my control." The scene changed again, this time showing a woman with hair as dark as night and eyes that mirrored Arden's. Her mother. She sought to sever the curse, Solara continued, her gaze on Arden. But she failed. Instead, she strengthened it, believing she could contain the Shadow Wolf's power. "Her actions bound you to this fate, as much as Kane is bound by his bloodline." Arden felt like the air had been knocked out of her. Her mother, her own mother, had played a role in perpetuating the curse. She looked down at the mark on her palm, her thoughts swirling. "She never told me," Arden said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She never said anything about this." "Because she thought she could protect you from it," Solara said gently. "But the curse cannot be ignored. It grows stronger the more it is denied." Kane's fists clenched at his sides. "So what now? You've shown us your tragic story. What do we do about it?" Solara's gaze hardened. "The curse can only be broken by what it was meant to destroy, a bond of true love. Not strength born of power, but strength born of vulnerability." Only when you embrace the bond, when you accept what you fear most, will the shadow wolf's hold be broken. Kane's eyes darkened, his voice sharp. You're saying this is on me. It is on both of you, Solara replied, her voice steady. The bond is not one-sided. You must face your fears together, or you will fall together. The light around Solara began to fade, her figure growing translucent, but her voice lingered, heavy with warning. The shadow wolf grows stronger. It will stop at nothing to destroy you, to sever the bond before it can take hold. If you hesitate, if you doubt, you will lose. Her final words echoed through the chamber as her form vanished entirely. The blood moon rises soon. Choose wisely. The chamber fell silent once more, the runes dimming until only the faintest glow remained. Arden stood frozen, her thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, fear, and determination. Kane turned away from the pedestal, his expression unreadable. We know what we have to do, he said gruffly. Let's get out of here. But as they made their way back through the tomb, Arden couldn't shake the weight of Solara's words, or the realization that breaking the curse would require something far more difficult than fighting. It would require trust, and that was the one thing Kane Thornriver seemed incapable of giving. The path away from Solara's tomb was quieter than it should have been. No howls of distant rogues, no rustle of wind through the trees. Just the crunch of boots on gravel and the occasional drip of water from the moss-covered rocks overhead. It was the kind of quiet that pressed on a person's chest, heavy and unrelenting. Kane Thornriver walked a few steps ahead, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold night air. His mind churned with Solara's words, her warnings coiling around his thoughts like barbed wire. The bond is not one-sided. You must face your fears together. He shook his head, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Vulnerability wasn't his strength. It never had been. Behind him, Arden Mistveil moved with deliberate steps, her green eyes scanning the shadows. She wasn't thinking about potential threats, though. Her mind was fixed on her mother, the woman she thought she'd known. She sought to sever the curse, but she failed. The words hung in her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. They stopped for the night at the edge of a clearing, the glow of the moon barely filtering through the canopy above. Kane built the fire without a word, his movements efficient but mechanical. Arden sat across from him, her back against a fallen log, the mark on her palm still faintly visible in the flickering light. The fire crackled, sending embers spiraling into the darkness. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't unfamiliar, but tonight, it felt heavier, laden with everything that had been said and unsaid in the tomb. Finally, Arden broke the silence. You don't have to carry it all, you know. Kane didn't look up from the fire. What are you talking about? The weight, she said, gesturing vaguely at him. Of the pact, of the curse, of everything. It's written all over you. He let out a humorless laugh, leaning back against the rock behind him. You think it's that simple? Just let it go? No, Arden admitted, but I think pretending you can handle it all isn't helping anyone, least of all you. Kane's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the fire. I don't have a choice. They look to me for strength. If I falter, the whole pack falls apart. Strength isn't about never faltering, Arden said softly. It's about getting back up when you do. He shook his head, his voice low and bitter. You don't understand. My father, he led with his heart. He trusted too much, and it got him killed. The pack nearly fell apart after that. I swore I wouldn't make the same mistake. Arden studied him, her expression softening. You think letting people in makes you weak, doesn't it? Kane asked, his voice sharp. Every time I've trusted someone, they've let me down. Every time I've relied on someone, I've paid the price. Not every time, Arden said, her tone even but insistent. You've trusted your warriors. You've trusted Ronan. She hesitated, then added, you trusted me enough to bring me here. He looked up at her then, his gray eyes shadowed but searching. That's different. Why? She asked, leaning forward. Because I'm the bond you're trying so hard to reject. Because you think trusting me means losing control? Kane didn't answer, but the flicker of something in his eyes told her she'd hit a nerve. Arden sighed, leaning back against the log. "Do you know why I stayed?" she asked after a moment. Kane frowned, his gaze shifting to her. "What do you mean?" "I could have walked away," she said. "After the pack made it clear they didn't want me there. After you made it clear you didn't trust me. But I didn't." "Why?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Because I'm tired of running," Arden said, her voice firm but tinged with vulnerability. "My whole life I've been chasing something, answers, purpose, a place to belong. And when I found out about the curse, about my mother's role in it, I knew I couldn't keep running. If I can prove myself, if I can help you break this, I'll finally have something real." Kane studied her, the firelight casting shadows across his face. For the first time, he saw something in her he hadn't allowed himself to see before. Strength, yes, but also a determination that mirrored his own. "You think breaking the curse will fix everything?" he said, his tone softer now. "I don't know," Arden admitted. "But it's a start." The silence between them stretched again, but this time it wasn't as heavy. It felt more like a pause, a moment of understanding hanging in the air. "You're not what I expected," Kane said finally. Arden raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "I'll take that as a compliment." "Don't get used to it," he said, but there was no edge in his tone. They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, the fire crackling between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. A beginning. And for Kane, who had spent so long closing himself off, it was a step further than he'd ever thought he'd take. As the fire began to die down, Kane glanced at Arden, who was staring into the flames with a faraway look in her eyes. The mark on her palm glowed faintly, a reminder of the bond they shared. "You know this isn't going to be easy," he said, his voice low. Arden looked up, meeting his gaze. "I know." "Then why are you so determined?" She smiled faintly, a flicker of firelight catching the green in her eyes. "Because you're worth fighting for. Even if you don't believe it." Kane didn't respond, but her words settled in his chest, heavier than he wanted to admit. As they settled in for the night, the shadows of the past still lingered, but for the first time, they didn't seem quite so overwhelming. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing. Kane Thornriver leaned back against a tree, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the shadows dancing in the trees. Across from him, Arden Mistvale sat cross-legged, her green eyes reflecting the dying light. Neither of them had spoken in a while, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy with anticipation, with everything they'd heard, seen, and couldn't yet say. The mark on Arden's palm began to tingle again, the faint glow breaking through the darkness. She stared at it, her breath catching as the world around her started to shift. The forest faded, the sounds of the night muffled until they disappeared completely. "Kane," she whispered, her voice tight. His head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he saw her frozen in place, the glow on her hand spreading. He moved toward her, but before he could reach her, the light consumed her completely, pulling her into a vision. Arden found herself back in the tomb, but this time, the runes on the walls burned brighter, their light casting sharp shadows over the carved figures. At the center of the room stood Solara's spirit, her expression grave, her silver robes flowing like water. "You've returned," Arden said, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her chest. "I never truly left," Solara replied. Her gaze softened, but the weight of her presence made the air feel heavy. "You've seen the path ahead. You understand the bond you share with Kane. But there is something you have yet to face." Arden stepped closer, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "If you're here to tell me more riddles—" "This is no riddle," Solara interrupted, her tone sharp. "Breaking the curse will come at a cost. A sacrifice must be made." Arden's chest tightened. "What kind of sacrifice?" Solara raised a hand, her fingers brushing the air. The runes on the walls flared again, forming two distinct images. On one side, Kane stood tall, his alpha presence undeniable. the weight of his leadership etched into every line of his face. On the other, Arden knelt before a glowing figure of the Moon Queen, her connection to the goddess radiating from her like a second skin. "You or Cain," Solara said, her voice heavy. "One of you must give up what defines you most." Arden stared at the images, her heart pounding. "What does that mean?" "For Cain," Solara explained, "it means relinquishing his alpha status. He must step down, severing his connection to the pack and the bond that ties him to leadership. For you, it means severing your connection to the Moon Queen, forsaking her guidance and the power she has given you." Arden's breath caught. "And if we don't?" "The curse will remain," Solara said simply. "The shadow mate will rise, stronger than ever, and it will destroy everything." The vision shifted, and Arden found herself standing beside Cain. He was staring at Solara, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. "You're asking me to abandon my pack," he said, his voice low but filled with anger. "I am asking you to save them," Solara replied. "The pack cannot thrive under the weight of this curse. Your pride as alpha is not worth their lives." Cain turned away, his chest heaving. "You think that's an easy choice? To walk away from everything I've built, everything I've fought for?" "It is not easy," Solara said, her voice softening. "But neither is what I ask of her." She turned to Arden, her pale eyes piercing. "The Moon Queen has chosen you for a reason. Your connection to her is a gift, but it is also a burden. Severing it would strip you of her power and her protection." Arden's throat tightened. "And if I do this, what happens to me?" "You will remain," Solara said. "But you will be mortal, vulnerable. The wolves may not accept you as one of their own." The words hit harder than Arden expected, but she forced herself to meet Solara's gaze. "I don't care about their acceptance. I care about stopping this." The vision dissolved and Arden found herself back in the clearing. Cain was leaning over her, his face etched with concern, but when her eyes fluttered open, his expression shifted into something unreadable. "What happened?" he asked, his voice gruff. Arden sat up slowly, her head spinning. "Solara," she said, her voice hoarse. "She told me what it will take to break the curse." Cain's eyes narrowed. "And?" She hesitated, the weight of the vision pressing down on her. "One of us has to sacrifice something important. You, your alpha status, and me," she faltered, looking down at the mark on her palm. "My connection to the Moon Queen." Cain straightened, his expression darkening. "She expects me to give up my pack." "She expects one of us to make a choice," Arden said, her voice firm. "If we don't, the curse wins." Cain's silence was deafening, the tension between them growing thicker by the second. He turned away, his shoulders stiff, his hands curling into fists. "This is insanity." "It's the truth," Arden shot back, standing to face him. "And you can't ignore it." He spun to face her, his gray eyes blazing. "You think it's that simple? That I can just walk away from everything? My pack needs me." "And they need you alive," Arden said, her voice rising. "The curse will destroy you, Cain. If you keep holding onto your pride, there won't be anything left of you or them." The fire crackled between them, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Cain's chest rose and fell with the force of his breathing, his gaze locked on hers. "This isn't just about me," he said finally, his voice quieter but no less intense. "You'd lose something too. Your power, your connection to the Moon Queen. Are you ready to give that up?" Arden hesitated, the weight of his words settling over her. She looked down at the mark on her palm, its faint glow a reminder of everything she stood to lose. "If it means breaking the curse," she said softly, "then yes. I'll give it up." Cain stared at her, his expression unreadable, before turning away again. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears and unmade decisions. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, the fire's embers glowing faintly, Arden felt the mark on her palm pulse once more. The Moon Queen's voice echoed in her mind, faint but clear. "The choice will test you both, but the bond must endure." And as Cain stood with his back to her, his silhouette framed by the fading night, Arden realized that the hardest part of the journey wasn't the tomb or the curse. It was each other. Chapter 5. The stone market was a city in miniature crumbling stone archways, rickety stalls propped up by weathered wood, and the constant hum of voices bouncing off the cracked walls. Lanterns hung on rusted hooks, casting flickering light over a crowd of wolves and merchants that never seemed to stop moving. The place stank of damp earth and desperation, a mixing pot of pack alliances, rivalries, and secrets. Arden Mistval walked a few steps behind Ronan, her green eyes darting across the shifting crowd. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Ronan's usual swagger had been replaced by a clipped pace, his shoulders stiff, his head swiveling too often to scan the market. "I thought we were here for supplies," Arden said, her tone casual but probing. Ronan didn't look at her. "We are. Stick close. This place isn't exactly friendly to outsiders." The remark stung more than it should have, but Arden let it slide. She wasn't here to make friends, and Ronan wasn't exactly a ray of sunshine. Still, there was something in his voice sharp, restless, that set her on edge. Ronan stopped at a stall selling what looked like half-rotted pelts and scraps of bone. He muttered a few words to the merchant, who nodded toward an alley that disappeared between two looming stone buildings. Arden stepped back, pretending to inspect a rack of rusted blades, but her attention was fixed on Ronan as he slipped into the shadows. "Interesting," she murmured to herself. Waiting until he was out of sight, she moved quickly, her boots silent on the uneven cobblestones. The alley was darker than the rest of the market, its narrow walls pressing in like the jaws of a trap. She ducked behind a stack of crates, her heart pounding in her ears as she peered around the edge. Ronan stood a few feet away, his head tilted as he spoke to a figure cloaked in black. The stranger's face was hidden beneath a hood, but the sharpness of his posture and the way he gestured with precise movements made it clear he wasn't just another merchant. Arden strained to catch their words, the murmur of the market barely drowning them out. "The Alpha's losing control," Ronan said, his voice low but hard. "The curse is tearing him apart, and the pack's starting to see it." The cloaked figure nodded, their voice a rasp. "And the girl? The one tied to the Moon Queen?" "She's making it worse," Ronan snapped. "Kane's distracted. Half the warriors are whispering about her being the cause of all this." He hesitated, glancing around before leaning closer. "You tell Arya that if she moves fast, the Silverfang pack will crumble. I'll make sure of it." The words hit Arden like a punch to the gut. Her fingers gripped the edge of the crate, her nails digging into the wood as she fought to keep her breathing steady. The cloaked figure handed Ronan something small, glinting in the dim light. "Good. Arya's waiting. Don't disappoint her." Ronan pocketed the object and nodded. "I'll do what needs to be done." The figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ronan standing alone. Arden stepped out from behind the crates, her boots crunching on the cobblestones. "So," she said, her voice cold, "this is how you protect the pack." Ronan spun around, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" "Following you," Arden said, folding her arms. "Good thing, too. Otherwise, I might have missed the part where you sold out your alpha to Arya." Ronan's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "You don't understand what's happening, Mistvale. Kane's leadership is a sinking ship, and the curse is dragging us all down with him. I'm doing what I have to do to keep the pack alive. By handing us over to a rival alpha." Arden shot back. "You think Arya's going to stop at taking out Kane? She'll tear this pack apart, and you'll be her first casualty once she's done using you." Ronan's lips curled into a sneer. "You don't belong here, Arden. You're just a pawn in whatever game the Moon Queen's playing. Don't lecture me about loyalty when you're the reason this curse is spinning out of control." The words stung, but Arden held her ground. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "The curse isn't about me. It's about cowards like you who think betrayal is strength." Ronan stepped closer, his eyes flashing with anger. "Watch yourself, healer. You don't know how far I'm willing to go." "Neither do you," Arden said, her voice icy. "But I'll make one thing clear: I won't let you destroy this pack." They stared each other down, the tension between them thick enough to cut. Finally, Ronan turned on his heel and stormed out of the alley, leaving Arden alone in the shadows. Arden leaned against the crates, her breath shaky as the reality of what she'd heard sank in. Ronan's betrayal wasn't just a threat to Cain, it was a threat to all of them. And now, more than ever, she knew she had to find a way to break the curse before it tore the Silver Fang pack apart. As she stepped back into the chaos of the stone market, the sound of voices and clinking metal filled her ears. But her focus was razor sharp. She had a mission now, one that went beyond just saving Cain. She had to save them all. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the skeletal ruins of the stone market, casting long, jagged shadows across the uneven cobblestones. The market had begun to quiet, the cacophony of traders hawking wares fading into murmurs. Arden Mistvale stood by a stall, pretending to inspect a bundle of dried herbs while keeping her eyes on Ronan. His behavior had been strange all day, tense, twitchy, and more paranoid than usual. Ronan shifted from one foot to the other, his sharp eyes scanning the thinning crowd. Finally, he slipped into a shadowed alley without so much as a glance over his shoulder. Arden hesitated for only a moment before following him, her steps light and silent. The alley was narrow and dimly lit, the damp stone walls amplifying the sound of her heartbeat. She pressed herself against a stack of barrels, peering around the edge as Ronan stopped a few paces ahead. A figure cloaked in black stepped out from the shadows, their face obscured by the deep hood. "Ronan," the cloaked figure said, their voice a low rasp. "You're late." "I came as soon as I could," Ronan replied, his tone sharp but low. He folded his arms, trying to project confidence, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. "What do you have for me?" The figure produced a folded parchment, handing it to Ronan. "Aria's offer still stands. She's ready to move against Silverfang, but she needs to know you're committed." Ronan unfolded the parchment, scanning its contents. "I've already given you information on Cain's weaknesses. What else does she need from me?" "Assurance," the emissary said, their tone cold. "You've been feeding us scraps, Ronan. We need something solid, something that proves you're willing to go all in." Ronan's jaw clenched. "Cain's leadership is crumbling," he said. "The curse is tearing him apart, and the pack is starting to turn against him. Aria can swoop in and finish the job, but I won't risk open rebellion unless I know the pack will survive." The emissary chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "You think Aria cares about the pack's survival? She wants control, Ronan. And that healer, the one tied to the Moon Queen, she's the key." Arden's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. "She's not part of this," Ronan said, his tone faltering slightly. "She's part of all of it," the emissary countered. "Aria wants her alive. Whatever bond she has with Cain, it's tied to the curse. If we take her, we weaken him further." Ronan hesitated, the parchment crumpling slightly in his grip. "I'll think about it." "You don't have time to think," the emissary said, their voice turning icy. "The blood moon is coming. And when it rises, so does the shadow wolf. Make your choice, Ronan." Soon, the figure melted back into the shadows, leaving Ronan standing alone in the alley. Arden stepped out from her hiding spot, her boots crunching against the cobblestones. "So this is what you've been up to." Ronan spun around, his eyes narrowing as they landed on her. "Arden," he said, his voice laced with irritation. "You shouldn't be here. And you shouldn't be selling out your pack," she shot back, crossing her arms. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? What you're risking?" "I'm risking everything," Ronan snapped, "because Cain is driving us straight into ruin. The curse has made him unstable, and the pack needs stability. Aria can give us that." "Aria?" Arden's voice rose, disbelief coloring her tone. "She's not offering stability, she's offering a noose. Do you really think she'll stop at Cain? She'll take everything, and you'll be the first casualty once she's done using you." Ronan took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "You don't understand what it's like to watch the pack you've sworn to protect fall apart. You don't understand the weight of loyalty, Arden." "Don't lecture me about loyalty," she said, her voice cold. "You're the one stabbing your alpha in the back. And for what? A false promise from a rival alpha who doesn't care if you live or die." Ronan sneered. And what about you? You show up with your Moon Queen magic and your bond, and suddenly we're all supposed to believe you're here to save us. Your presence is dividing the pack, not saving it. If anything, you're the curse." The words stung, but Arden refused to let him see it. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "The curse isn't me. The curse is the betrayal and fear that people like you feed on. You're not saving the pack, Ronan. You're dooming it." They stood in tense silence, the weight of her words hanging between them. Finally, Ronan scoffed and turned away. "You don't know anything, Arden," he said over his shoulder. "Stay out of my way." Arden stood alone in the alley, her hands curling into fists at her sides. The truth of what she'd overheard was a heavy weight in her chest, but it also brought clarity. Ronan wasn't just a threat to Cain, he was a threat to all of them. And now she knew that Arya's sights were set on her. As she stepped back into the chaos of the stone market, Arden's resolve hardened. Whatever it took, she wouldn't let Ronan's betrayal destroy the Silverfang pack. And she wouldn't let Arya win. The Alpha's keep was a fortress of stone and silence, its grand hall dimly lit by flickering torches mounted on the walls. The council gathered around a long, weathered table that had seen more battles discussed than it had feasts served. Tension hung heavy in the air, like the prelude to a storm, as Cain Thornriver took his seat at the head of the table. His jaw was set, his eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to question his authority. Arden Mistfell stood near the back of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She felt the weight of every gaze that flickered her way, some filled with suspicion, others with open disdain. She had never felt more like an outsider. Ronan sat to Cain's right, his expression carefully neutral, though his sharp eyes betrayed a calculating mind. The rest of the council members, a mix of elders and warriors, murmured among themselves, their voices low but pointed. Cain raised a hand, silencing the room with a single motion. "The rogues are growing bolder," he began, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "Their attacks are no longer random. They're organized, strategic. Someone is feeding them information." The council erupted into murmurs, the accusations flying fast. "It's the curse," one elder said, his voice trembling. "The shadow wolf is stirring." "Or maybe it's weakness in leadership," another muttered, his gaze flicking to Cain. Cain's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Ronan leaned forward, his voice smooth as silk. "Perhaps it's neither," Ronan said, his words measured. "Perhaps the problem lies closer to home." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Ronan, who paused just long enough to let the tension build before continuing. "We've all seen the changes since Arden arrived," Ronan said, his tone almost conversational. "The Moon Queen's mark on her is no secret. And while some might call it a gift, others might see it as an invitation." Arden's heart sank, but she forced herself to stand tall. "What exactly are you implying, Ronan?" she asked, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. Ronan turned to her, a faint smirk playing at his lips. "I'm implying nothing. I'm simply asking questions. Questions we should all be asking." He gestured to the room. "The curse has grown stronger since your arrival. The rogues are targeting us with more precision than ever before. And the shadow wolf? Well, it's no coincidence that it manifests in the presence of someone tied to the Moon Queen." "That's enough," Cain growled, his voice low and dangerous. But Ronan wasn't finished. He turned to the rest of the council, his voice rising. "I'm not questioning Arden's intentions, of course, but we can't ignore the facts. Her bond to Cain is unsealed. The Moon Queen's influence is unpredictable, and the pack is paying the price for it." The murmur started again, louder this time. "Maybe he's right. We didn't have these problems before she showed up. The curse, it could be tied to her." Arden stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "The curse isn't tied to me," she said, her green eyes flashing. "It's tied to Cain's bloodline, something that existed long before I ever set foot in this pack." Her gaze swept across the room, daring anyone to challenge her. "You're looking for someone to blame, because it's easier than facing the truth. But pointing fingers won't break the curse. It won't save your pack." only facing it head on. Will. The room fell silent again, but the tension was palpable. The doors to the hall creaked open, and all heads turned as Sable Evanstar stepped inside. The seer moved with an eerie grace, her silver hair shimmering in the torchlight, her piercing eyes scanning the room. "You bicker like pups fighting over scraps," she said, her voice cold and sharp. And all the while, the shadow wolf grows stronger. Sable moved to the center of the room, her presence commanding. "The blood moon is coming. When it rises, the shadow wolf will take its true form. It will strike at your weaknesses, your divisions, and your fears. If you do not unite, you will fall." She turned to Cain, her gaze unwavering. "And you, Alpha. The bond you reject is the only thing standing between your pack and destruction. The shadow wolf feeds on your denial. The longer you resist, the stronger it becomes." Cain's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Sable's eyes shifted to Ronan. "And betrayal will only hasten its rise." Ronan stiffened, but he said nothing. As Sable's words hung in the air, the room erupted once more. Some council members argued for immediate action, while others continued to cast blame. Arden felt the weight of their distrust, but she also saw something else, a crack in their unity, one that Ronan was expertly exploiting. Cain finally stood, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough. The council is dismissed. We'll reconvene when we have actionable plans." One by one, the council members filed out, their whispers trailing behind them. Ronan was the last to leave, glancing at Arden before disappearing into the shadows. As the room emptied, Arden approached Cain, her expression wary. "You know Ronan's trying to undermine you, don't you?" Cain nodded, his shoulders heavy with the weight of leadership. "I know, but I can't call him out without proof. Not yet." Arden hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. "He's not just undermining you. He's undermining us. And if we don't stop him, the shadow wolf won't need to tear us apart, we'll do it ourselves." Cain met her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "I won't let that happen." Arden nodded, though the tension in her chest didn't ease. The battle against the curse was no longer just about breaking it, it was about surviving the divisions it created. The room grew darker as the torches along the walls sputtered, casting long shadows over the faces of the pack council. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the storm outside the keep had seeped into the hall itself. The tension was so sharp you could cut it with a blade, and everyone was looking for someone to blame. Cain Thornriver leaned forward, his hands braced against the table, his jaw set in that stubborn way of his. "We need unity now more than ever," he growled. "If we're divided, we've already lost." Ronan, sitting too comfortably for Arden's liking, leaned back in his chair and tilted his head, his voice smooth as silk. "And what if the division is coming from within? What if it's not the rogues or the shadow wolf that will destroy us, but something or someone closer to home?" His words sent a ripple through the room, murmurs rising like an undertow. Arden's chest tightened as she saw the way some of the elders glanced her way, suspicion flickering in their eyes. "I've had enough of this," she snapped, stepping forward. Her voice was clear and sharp, cutting through the murmurs. "Blaming each other won't solve anything. We need to focus on breaking the curse, not tearing each other apart." "And how do we do that?" Ronan asked, his eyes narrowing. "By trusting the Moon Queen's chosen, who just happened to show up when the curse grew stronger. Forgive me if I'm skeptical." The hall doors creaked open, and the murmurs fell silent as Sable Evenstar strode in. Her presence was like ice on a flame, extinguishing every voice in the room. Dressed in flowing robes that shimmered with silver thread, she moved with an eerie grace, her piercing eyes sweeping the room. "You bicker like pups snapping over scraps," she said, her voice low and cutting. "And all the while, the true danger grows." The torches flared as she spoke, their light casting shadows that danced unnaturally across the walls. The pack members shifted uneasily in their seats, even Ronan, who suddenly looked less confident. Cain straightened, his expression hard but respectful. "Sable, if you've come with guidance, we need it now." Sable stopped at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly on its surface. She stared at Cain, Then at Arden, her gaze lingering before sweeping over the rest of the room. "The blood moon rises in 3 days," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "And with it, the shadow wolf will seek to break free of its chains. Its claws thrive on betrayal, and its hunger is fed by division." Her eyes locked onto Ronan, and though she didn't say his name, the implication was clear. Ronan stiffened, but he didn't speak. Sable continued, her voice dropping lower, the weight of her words pressing on the room like a physical force. "An attack will come under the blood moon's light, and it will test the strength of this pack. If you fail to stand together, you will fall. All of you." She turned to Cain. "Alpha, the bond you reject is the only weapon strong enough to break the curse. Deny it any longer, and you risk losing everything." Cain's fists clenched, his jaw tightening as he avoided looking at Arden. The tension in his shoulders was visible, and the room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for his response. Finally, Sable stepped back from the table. "You have 3 days. The choices you make between now and then will decide whether this pack survives or whether it becomes another tragedy in the Shadow Wolf's legacy." She turned and left the room as abruptly as she had entered, leaving an oppressive silence in her wake. As the council began to disperse, Arden moved toward Ronan, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, her voice low but sharp. Ronan glanced at her, his expression cool and unbothered. "And what game is that?" "Undermining Cain. Undermining us," she hissed. "You think you're doing what's best for the pack, but all you're doing is making us weaker." Ronan stepped closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "And you think you're the savior this pack needs? The Moon Queen's chosen? You don't belong here, Arden. You never did. The pack sees it, even if Cain doesn't." Arden's fists clenched, but she forced herself to take a step back. "I'm not going to let you destroy everything because you're afraid of change." Ronan smirked. "Afraid of change? No, Mistveil. I'm afraid of what happens when you're the one holding the reins, and I'm not alone." His words struck deeper than she wanted to admit, and as he walked away, Arden felt the stares of the remaining pack members lingering on her. Whispers followed in Ronan's wake, and she knew the damage he was doing wasn't something she could easily undo. Arden stepped outside the keep, the cold night air biting against her skin. She looked up at the moon, her chest tight with frustration. Ronan was poisoning the pack against her, and Cain was too consumed by his own fears to stop it. But she wasn't going to let them win, not Ronan, not the Shadow Wolf, and not the curse. She closed her eyes, the mark on her palm tingling faintly. If the pack wouldn't trust her, she'd prove herself through action. The blood moon was coming, and with it, the fight of their lives. And Arden was determined to be ready. The Moonspire Temple stood like a ghost of a forgotten time, its jagged spires clawing at the sky, silhouetted against the pale glow of the rising moon. Cracks ran through the stone walls, and faint carvings of the Moon Queen's sigils shimmered faintly in the moonlight, casting an otherworldly glow on the ruins. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of ancient power, and something darker lingering beneath. Cain Thornriver moved through the crumbled remains of the temple, with the fluid precision of a predator, his eyes scanning the shadows that stretched long and deep across the rocky terrain. Behind him, Arden Mistveil kept her steps light, her senses on high alert. There was something off about the silence that wrapped around the patrol, something too quiet, too unnatural. "It doesn't feel right," Arden murmured, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Cain's jaw tightened. "It's not supposed to feel right. This place hasn't seen a living wolf in generations." Ahead of them, 2 warriors flanked the patrol, their heads swiveling as they scanned the ruins. The air carried a faint metallic tang, the kind of scent that came before blood. The attack came swift and brutal. A shadow moved too fast for the eye to follow, and then another. The first warrior went down with a choked growl, his body dragged into the shadows before anyone could react. Rogues. Cain barked, his voice cutting through the eerie silence like a blade. The remaining patrol formed a defensive circle, their weapons drawn, but the rogues didn't rush them. Instead, they prowled just beyond the light, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Their movements were calculated, precise. This wasn't the disorganized chaos of a typical rogue attack. This was a trap. Cain, Arden said, her voice steady but urgent. They're trying to isolate us. Cain's eyes flicked to her, his instincts screaming to keep her close. But before he could respond, the ground beneath them shifted. A net of vines, thick and unnatural, shot up from the earth, forcing the group apart. Arden was yanked backward, her hands scrambling to tear at the vines as they tightened around her waist. Arden! Cain roared, slashing through the vines that blocked his path. But the rogues moved faster. Arden was dragged away from the group, her figure disappearing into the shadows as Cain's voice echoed in her ears. The rogues brought Arden to the edge of the ruins where the moonlight painted the ground in pale silver. Her captors were strong, their claws digging into her arms as they forced her to kneel. She glared up at them, defiance blazing in her eyes despite the tightness in her chest. A figure emerged from the shadows, a wolf with an aura of authority that Arden recognized instantly. Arya. The rival alpha was tall and imposing, her fur streaked with scars that spoke of countless battles. Her golden eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating light as she looked down at Arden. Well, well, Arya said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. The Moon Queen's chosen, all wrapped up and delivered to me. What do you want? Arden spat, struggling against the rogues holding her. Arya crouched in front of her, her expression turning almost pitying. What I want is simple, little healer. You're going to help me summon the Shadow Wolf. Arden's blood ran cold. You don't know what you're playing with, she said. The Shadow Wolf will destroy everything including you. Arya laughed, a sound devoid of humor. You think I don't know that? The difference is, I'm prepared to control it. Your bond with Cain, your connection to the Moon Queen makes you the perfect vessel. With you, I'll command the Shadow Wolf, and Silverfang will fall. Arden's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. You're a fool if you think the Shadow Wolf can be controlled. It'll destroy you the moment it's free. Arya's smile sharpened. Then I suppose I'll just have to make sure you don't fail me. Cain tore through the rogues with a ferocity that bordered on primal. His claws slashed through flesh and bone, his growls echoing off the temple walls. The warriors at his side fought valiantly, but Cain's focus was singular. Find Arden. He broke through the final line of rogues, emerging into the clearing where Arden knelt before Arya. The sight of her bound but unbroken ignited something in him, a fury that burned hotter than the moonlight above. Let her go, Arya, Cain snarled, his voice low and deadly. Arya turned to him, unfazed by the blood dripping from his claws. You're too late, Thornriver. She's already mine. Cain didn't wait for her to finish. He lunged, his speed unmatched as he collided with Arya. The two alphas clashed with a force that shook the ground, their growls and snarls tearing through the night. As the battle raged around her, Arden focused on the mark on her palm. It glowed faintly, a reminder of her connection to the Moon Queen. She closed her eyes, reaching out with her thoughts, her energy, until the vines binding her began to loosen. When she was free, she wasted no time. She grabbed a fallen dagger from the ground and turned to the nearest rogue, her movements quick and precise. Arden, get out of here, Cain shouted, his voice strained as he grappled with Arya. But Arden didn't leave. She fought her way to his side, her determination unwavering. Together they forced Arya and her rogues back, the tide of the battle turning in their favor. The rogues retreated into the shadows, their numbers decimated. Arya stood at the edge of the clearing, her golden eyes locked on Cain and Arden. This isn't over, she hissed, her voice venomous. The blood moon will rise, and when it does, you'll see just how powerless you really are. With that, she disappeared, leaving Cain and Arden standing alone in the ruins. Cain turned to Arden, his breathing heavy, his gray eyes stormy. Are you hurt? Arden shook her head, though her body ached from the fight. I'm fine. "You should have left," he said, his tone sharp. "And let you face her alone?" She shot back. "Not a chance." Their gazes locked, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Finally, Kane exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "We need to prepare," he said. "Arya won't stop until she gets what she wants." "And neither will we," Arden replied, her voice firm. As they turned back toward the keep, the moonlight bathed the ruins in silver, a reminder of the battle yet to come. The Moonspire Temple loomed like a phantom in the distance, its broken spires jagged against the night sky. The pale light of the moon danced over the ancient carvings etched into the stone, their glowing patterns pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blood. Kane Thornriver's senses were sharp, his pulse steady, even as chaos erupted around him. He tore through another rogue, his claws slicing cleanly through the attacker's flank. His warriors fought alongside him, but the rogues were relentless, their ambush precise. Kane's instincts told him this wasn't just an attack, it was a calculated move. And the prize wasn't the warriors of Silverfang, it was Arden. "Push forward," Kane barked, his voice carrying over the sounds of the battle. "We don't stop until we reach her." The path to the Moonspire was a battlefield. Rogues darted in and out of the shadows, their glowing eyes like fireflies in the darkness. Kane moved with precision, his strikes lethal. But for every rogue that fell, 2 more seemed to take their place. He glanced back to see his warriors struggling to hold their ground. Ronan wasn't there, he'd disappeared after the ambush, his absence gnawing at Kane like a wound. But there wasn't time to dwell on betrayal. Arden was somewhere ahead, and every second counted. "Kane," one of his warriors called out, pointing toward the glowing ruins. "They've taken her to the temple." Kane's heart tightened. The Moonspire Temple wasn't just a relic, it was a place tied to the curse, a place where the lines between the physical and the mystical blurred. If the rogues were trying to use Arden as part of some twisted ritual, then the stakes were higher than he'd feared. Arden struggled against the ropes binding her wrists, her breath ragged as 2 rogues dragged her deeper into the temple. The air here was colder, heavier, as though the walls themselves were alive and watching. The glowing carvings pulsed faster now, their light flickering as though in rhythm with her heartbeat. Arya's voice cut through the darkness, sharp and cruel. "You feel it, don't you? The Moon Queen's power running through this place. It's connected to you, healer. And soon, it'll be mine." "You don't know what you're doing," Arden spat, glaring up at her. "The Shadow Wolf can't be controlled. You'll destroy yourself and your pack." Arya crouched in front of her, her golden eyes glinting. "Perhaps. But if it means destroying Silverfang, it's a price I'm willing to pay." Before Arden could respond, the temple trembled, the carvings flaring brightly as the sound of battle reached the inner chamber. "Your Alpha has come for you," Arya said, standing. "Let's see if he can save you." Kane burst through the temple doors, his eyes locking onto Arden immediately. The rogues turned to face him, but he didn't hesitate. His claws tore through the first 2 attackers, his growl low and deadly. "Kane," Arden shouted, struggling against her bonds. Arya stepped into his path, her expression calm but her stance ready. "You're predictable, Thornriver." Charging in, thinking brute strength will save the day. Kane didn't answer. He lunged at her, their clash echoing through the chamber as claws met claws. Arya was faster than he'd anticipated, but Kane's determination burned hotter than her fury. Meanwhile, Arden closed her eyes, focusing on the mark on her palm. She could feel the energy of the Moon Queen coursing through her, faint but steady. She whispered an incantation her mother had taught her long ago, and the glowing carvings on the walls responded, their light spreading toward her bonds. The ropes began to loosen, the strands unraveling as though pulled by invisible hands. Arden broke free just as Kane knocked Arya to the ground. But before he could strike the final blow, the rival Alpha smirked and whistled sharply. More rogues poured into the chamber, surrounding Kane and Arden. Kane snarled, his body tensing as he prepared to fight. But Arden stepped forward, her palm glowing with the Moon Queen's light. "Get behind me," she said, her voice steady. "Arden, trust me." The glowing light spread outward, filling the chamber. The rogues hesitated, their snarls fading into uneasy growls. Arden raised her hand, and the light flared brighter, forcing the rogues to retreat, their bodies vanishing into the shadows. When the chamber finally fell silent, Arden lowered her hand, her body trembling from the effort. Cain approached her, his gray eyes scanning her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" Arden shook her head, though her voice was shaky. "I'm fine." Aria's voice echoed from the shadows, sharp and venomous. "This isn't over, Thorn River. The blood moon will rise, and when it does, the shadow wolf will devour everything you hold dear." Before Cain could respond, Aria disappeared, her presence leaving an ominous weight in the air. Cain turned to Arden, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "You saved us," he said, his voice low. Arden met his gaze, her chin lifting. "We saved each other." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Finally, Cain nodded, his hand brushing hers briefly before he turned toward the temple's exit. As they stepped out into the moonlit night, the ruins of the moonspire behind them, Arden felt the weight of what lay ahead. The blood moon was coming, and with it, a battle that would test everything: her bond with Cain, her connection to the Moon Queen, and the strength of the pack itself. But for now they had survived, and survival, she knew, was the first step to victory. Chapter 6. The entrance to Solara's tomb yawned open like the mouth of a beast, jagged and dark against the silver glow of the moonlight. The air was colder here, a biting chill that clung to the skin and wormed its way into the bones. Cain Thorn River stepped inside, his boots crunching softly against the loose gravel on the ground. He didn't look back at Arden Misfell, but he felt her presence behind him, steady, sure, and as unrelenting as the pull of the moon. The inside of the tomb felt alive, the carvings on the walls glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something darker, sharper, like iron. Cain's jaw tightened as he scanned the narrow passage ahead. "Does it feel different to you?" Arden asked, her voice low. Cain nodded once, his eyes narrowing. "It's colder than it was before. Like the air's been drained of life." Arden's gaze drifted to the glowing carvings, her fingers brushing lightly over the symbols. "The shadow wolf's presence is stronger here. It's feeding off something, our doubts, maybe. Our fears." Cain didn't respond, but the weight of her words settled heavily on his shoulders. They reached the heart of the tomb, a circular chamber where the carvings on the walls converged into a swirling pattern at the center of the floor. The glow intensified, illuminating the cracks in the ancient stone and casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then, the temperature dropped sharply, and a faint mist began to rise from the carvings. Cain's hand instinctively went to his dagger, but Arden touched his arm lightly. "Wait," she said. "It's her." The mist coalesced into a figure, Solara. Her form was ethereal, her features sharp and striking, though her eyes carried the weight of centuries of pain. This time there was no anger in her expression, no fiery vengeance. Instead, there was sorrow. "Solara," Arden whispered. The spirit turned her gaze to Arden, then to Cain. "You've returned," Solara said, her voice soft but laced with regret. "And the curse grows stronger." Cain stepped forward, his expression hard. "You summoned the shadow wolf. You cursed my bloodline, and now it's threatening to destroy everything. Why?" Solara's gaze shifted to him, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I summoned the shadow wolf out of grief, out of rage. I was betrayed by the one I loved most, your ancestor. He rejected me for power, cast me aside like I was nothing. My pain gave birth to the shadow wolf, a creature born of vengeance." She looked down, her form flickering slightly. "But I didn't realize what I had unleashed. The shadow wolf is no longer bound by my pain alone. It has grown, fed by the denial and fear of your bloodline." Her eyes flicked to Arden. "And now it feeds on you as well, in your doubts, your hesitations. Every moment of division between you and Cain strengthens it." Arden's chest tightened. "How do we stop it?" Solara's form grew steadier, her voice gaining strength. "Unity. The bond between you is the key. Only through true, selfless unity can you weaken the shadow wolf. But the path will not be easy." The creature thrives on betrayal and division, and it will do everything in its power to tear you apart. Kane's fists clenched at his sides. You're asking me to trust a bond I never wanted, a bond that's been nothing but a curse to my family. Solara's gaze sharpened. And what has your denial brought you, Alpha? Strength? Or ruin? The curse is not the bond, it is your refusal to accept it. Her words hit like a blow, but Kane held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Solara turned back to Arden, her voice softening. And you, healer. You carry the Moon Queen's mark, but you doubt your place in this pack, in this bond. That doubt weakens you and him. Arden swallowed hard, the truth of Solara's words settling uncomfortably in her chest. Solara stepped back, her form beginning to fade. The blood moon is coming. When it rises, the shadow wolf will manifest fully. If you are not united by then, it will destroy you both and everything you love. As Solara's spirit faded, the carvings on the walls dimmed, leaving the chamber bathed in shadows. The coldness in the air lingered, and the silence felt oppressive. Kane turned to Arden, his gray eyes dark and stormy. Do you believe her? Arden met his gaze, her green eyes steady despite the turmoil inside her. I don't think we have a choice. Kane's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his fists clenching again. Unity, he muttered, the word like a curse. Arden stepped closer, her voice softer now. Kane, this isn't just about us. It's about the pack. If we don't stop the shadow wolf, it won't matter who's alpha or who's healer. Everything will be gone. For a moment he said nothing, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Finally he nodded, though the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. Let's get out of here, he said, his voice rough. As they left the tomb, the glow of the carvings flickering faintly behind them, Arden couldn't shake the feeling that Solara's words were more than a warning, they were a challenge, and whether they rose to meet it or not would determine everything. The air inside Solara's tomb was thick with an oppressive stillness, the kind that wrapped around you like a smothering shroud. Kane and Arden stood in the heart of the ancient chamber, where the glowing carvings on the walls flickered like dying embers. The room seemed to hum with a low vibration, the kind that you felt in your chest more than heard. Kane's shoulders were taut, his body coiled like a spring. Arden's green eyes darted around the chamber, wary of every shadow, every flicker of light. Neither spoke, but the weight of unspoken questions hung heavy between them. And then, the temperature dropped. The carvings on the walls brightened, casting eerie, dancing shadows. A faint mist began to swirl in the center of the room, coalescing into the spectral form of Solara. Her presence seemed heavier this time, her expression more grave. You've returned, Solara said, her voice carrying a weight that made the room seem even smaller. And so has the shadow wolf. Kane took a step forward, his gray eyes narrowing. No riddles this time, Solara. We need answers. What's happening? Why is the shadow wolf growing stronger? Solara's gaze swept over him, then lingered on Arden. The shadow wolf has always been bound to the blood moon, she began, her tone laced with regret. It is the moment when its power reaches its peak, when it can finally break free of its chains. But this time, the blood moon carries more danger than ever before. She turned to Arden, her expression unreadable. Because of you. Arden stiffened, her hands curling into fists. What does that mean? Solara's voice softened, but the gravity of her words cut deep. Arya plans to use you, Arden. Your connection to the Moon Queen makes you a conduit for power that the Shadow Wolf can harness. If she succeeds, the Shadow Wolf will be unbound. It will destroy everything in its path, starting with Kane's pack. Kane growled low in his throat, his fists clenching. Why Arden? Why not me? Solara's gaze turned to him, her spectral form flickering slightly. Because Arden is untainted by the curse that plagues your bloodline. She is pure, a vessel capable of amplifying the Shadow Wolf's power beyond anything I ever imagined. Arden's voice was steady, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her unease. Why would Arya do this? She can't control the shadow wolf, it'll destroy her too. Solara's lips curled into a bitter smile. Arya believes she can control it. She is blinded by ambition, by her hatred for Silverfang. She sees the shadow wolf as a weapon, one that will bring her ultimate victory. But she doesn't understand its true nature. What is its true nature? Arden asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Solara's form grew darker, her features more shadowed. The shadow wolf was born of betrayal and vengeance. It thrives on division, on fear, on doubt. It is not a weapon to be wielded, it is a force of destruction, unstoppable once unleashed. She turned to Cain, her voice sharp. And it feeds on you, Alpha. Your denial of the bond, your refusal to accept what you fear most, it gives the shadow wolf strength. Every moment you push Arden away, you weaken your ability to fight it. Cain's jaw tightened, his gray eyes flashing with defiance. I didn't ask for this bond. I didn't ask for any of it. Solara's gaze didn't waver. Neither did I. But the choices we make define our fate, not the ones we are given. The carvings on the walls began to glow brighter, the light pulsating like a heartbeat. Solara's form flickered, her voice turning more urgent. The blood moon is coming, and with it, the shadow wolf will manifest fully. Arya will use Arden to unleash its power, and when she does, nothing will stop it. Arden stepped forward, her voice firm despite the fear swirling in her chest. How do we stop her? Solara's eyes softened, and for a moment, the weight of centuries of regret showed in her expression. The bond between you is the key. Unity is the only thing that can weaken the shadow wolf. But it is not enough to fight together, you must trust each other completely and without hesitation. Only then can you sever the shadow wolf's connection to this world. Cain's fists clenched again, his body rigid. And if we don't? Solara's gaze darkened. If you don't, then the shadow wolf will destroy you, your pack and everything you hold dear. It will feed on your failures, on your divisions, until there is nothing left. Solara's form began to fade, her final words echoing through the chamber. The blood moon rises. Choose wisely. As the light dimmed and the chamber returned to its oppressive silence, Cain turned to Arden, his expression unreadable. Unity, he said, the word dripping with bitterness. That's what she wants from us. Arden met his gaze, her green eyes flashing. She wants us to stop pretending we can do this alone. If we don't figure out how to work together, Cain, none of this will matter. He scoffed, turning away. Easy for you to say. You're not the one cursed. Arden's patience snapped. You think this is easy for me? I didn't ask for this either, Cain. But here we are. And if you keep fighting me instead of the real enemy, you're going to lose everything. The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. Finally, Cain exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. Let's get out of here, he muttered, his voice quieter now. Arden didn't respond, but as they left the tomb, her resolve hardened. The shadow wolf was coming, and if Cain wouldn't face his fears, she would find a way to do it herself. The fire in Cain's chambers had burned low, leaving the room cloaked in shadows. The flickering embers cast jagged patterns across the stone walls, twisting and writhing like restless spirits. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the faint echo of something unnatural, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down his spine. Cain Thornriver lay on his cot, his body tense even in supposed rest. Sleep was a fleeting thing, haunted by the weight of his failures and the unrelenting pull of the bond he refused to accept. But tonight, the unease was sharper, more insistent. It wasn't just the curse gnawing at the edges of his mind, it was something else. The air in the room shifted, growing colder. Cain's eyes snapped open, and his breath fogged in the sudden chill. He sat up, his hand instinctively reaching for the blade beside his bed. You won't need that, a voice purred, smooth and syrupy, dripping with dangerous allure. Cain's eyes darted around the room, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then, out of the dim light of the dying fire, it emerged a wolf, but not one of flesh and blood. The creature was ethereal, its form a shimmering shadow that rippled and shifted as though made of smoke. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural silver light, piercing and hypnotic. "You," Cain growled, his voice low and dangerous. The shadow mate stepped closer, its movements graceful, almost seductive. Its voice was soft, melodic, yet it carried an edge that cut deep. "Yes, me, we've danced around this long enough, haven't we, Alpha?" Cain clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "What do you want?" The wolf tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "I want what you want, Cain. Power, freedom, strength beyond measure." It circled him, its voice weaving through the room like a siren's song. "You're tired of this, aren't you? The weight of the bond you never asked for, the prophecy, the endless expectations." Cain didn't respond, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed him. The shadow mate chuckled softly. "Ah, I see it. You've dreamed of casting it all aside, haven't you? Of ruling without the chains of destiny or the burden of love. Imagine it, Cain and Alpha unmatched, a leader whose power is his own, not tied to a healer's fragile existence or a curse-bound bloodline." The words slid under his skin, burrowing deep. Cain shook his head, trying to clear the fog creeping into his mind. "And what would that cost me?" "Everything." The shadow mate's grin widened, its teeth glinting like daggers. "Not everything. Just her." The room dissolved around Cain, and suddenly he was standing in the center of Silverfang's territory. But it was different. The air crackled with raw energy, and the wolves around him knelt, their heads bowed in absolute submission. He stood taller, stronger, his presence commanding without effort. "This is your future, Cain," the shadow mate said, its voice echoing in his mind. "A future where you rule with unchallenged power. No bonds, no curses, just strength." The vision shifted. Arden appeared at the edge of the scene, her green eyes filled with betrayal. She stood alone, her body frail, her connection to the Moon Queen severed. She reached for him, but the chasm between them widened, the ground splitting apart as she fell into the abyss. "Do you see it now?" The shadow mate whispered, its tone intoxicating. "She weakens you. The bond, the prophecy, it's a noose around your neck, dragging you down. Without her, you could have this." The vision of his powerful future shimmered before him, tantalizing and terrifying in equal measure. Cain's fists clenched as he pulled himself from the vision, his breathing ragged. The shadow mate stood before him, its glowing eyes watching him intently. "You can feel it, can't you?" it said softly. "The freedom, the power. All you have to do is let her go. Reject the bond once and for all, and I will give you everything." Cain's voice was low, but it carried a dangerous edge. "And if I don't?" The shadow mate's grin vanished, replaced by a cold, menacing stare. "Then you will fall, just as she will. The shadow wolf will devour everything you hold dear, and when the blood moon rises, there will be no salvation for you or your pack." The creature began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows of the room, but its parting words lingered, sharp and unyielding. "Think on it, Alpha. You don't have much time." As the air warmed again, and the fire's embers flickered weakly, Cain sat on the edge of his cot, his head in his hands. The shadow mate's words echoed in his mind, twisting and turning, until they became impossible to ignore. He thought of Arden, her fierce determination, her defiance, the way she challenged him in ways no one else dared to. But he also thought of the weight of the bond, the curse, the prophecy. Could he really carry it all? Could he risk everything for something he didn't fully understand? The moonlight, streaming through the window, painted his face in silver, its glow cold and unrelenting. Cain Thornriver sat in the silence of his chambers, caught between the lure of power and the fragile thread of hope that Arden represented. And for the first time, he didn't know which path he would choose. The darkness in Cain's chambers was impenetrable, save for the slivers of moonlight slipping through the cracks in the stone walls. The fire had died hours ago, leaving only the faint scent of ash in the air. He lay on his cot, eyes closed but far from rest, his mind tangled in the labyrinth of responsibilities and failures. Sleep had always been elusive, but tonight It felt like a trap, like closing his eyes would drag him into something deeper, something darker. And it did. Cain opened his eyes to find himself standing at the edge of the Silverfang territory. But it wasn't the territory he knew. The forest had grown thick and wild, the trees looming like sentinels with gnarled branches that twisted toward the sky. The wind carried an unnatural stillness, as though the world were holding its breath, and then he saw it himself. Canethorn River stood in the heart of the territory, towering and untouchable. His fur was sleek, his stance unyielding, and his eyes burned with a silver light that promised power. Wolves knelt before him, their heads bowed in reverence. He raised his hand, and the earth trembled at his command. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone demanded loyalty. You see it now, don't you? The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, low and smooth, laced with a dangerous kind of charm. Cain turned to see the shadow mate standing beside him. Its form more solid now, its smoky edges sharper. Its glowing eyes gleamed with satisfaction as it surveyed the vision of Cain's dominion. This is what you were meant to be, it said, stepping closer. An alpha who answers to no one. No curse. No bond. No weakness. Cain didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the wolves bowing before him. They were strong, united, their loyalty unwavering. It was everything he'd fought for, everything he thought he'd lost. You could have this, the shadow mate continued, its voice dripping with promise. The curse binds you no longer. The bond is a memory, and the your pack thrives under your rule. Cain's chest tightened. And what about Arden? The shadow mate chuckled, the sound low and mocking. Arden? It repeated, its tone laced with disdain. She was a distraction, a tether holding you back. Without her, you are free. The vision shifted. Arden appeared at the edge of the scene, her figure smaller, more fragile than he remembered. Her green eyes, once fierce and defiant, were hollow, her shoulders hunched as though carrying an invisible weight. You abandoned her? The shadow mate said softly. And she broke, just as they all do. But she was never meant to stand beside you. She was never meant to be part of your story. The vision changed again, the vibrant Silverfang territory dissolving into ash and ruin. The once loyal wolves lay scattered and lifeless, their blood staining the earth. Arden stood alone in the center of it all, her body trembling, her hands clutching the mark on her palm, as though it were a curse she couldn't escape. Her voice was faint, barely audible. You could have stopped this, Cain. Cain's breath caught in his throat as the scene shattered into darkness. The sound of laughter filled the void, low, guttural, and cruel. The shadow mate stepped into view, its smoky form shifting and twisting like a living nightmare. This is what happens when you deny what's in front of you, it said, its voice sharp and cutting now. You think you're strong, Canethorn River. But you're nothing without me. Its eyes flared, burning brighter as it loomed closer. Choose me, and you can rule without fear, without weakness. Deny me, and watch everything you love crumble into dust. Cain's eyes flew open, his chest heaving as he bolted upright in his cot. His body was slick with sweat, his heart pounding like a war drum. The room was quiet now, the fire long dead, the moonlight casting a pale glow across the stone floor. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his fingers trembling. The vision clung to him like a shadow. Every detail burned into his memory, the power, the ruin, Arden's broken form. He stood and crossed the room, gripping the edge of the stone windowsill as he stared out into the night. The moon hung heavy in the sky, its light cold and unforgiving. The shadow wolf's words echoed in his mind. Choose me or lose everything. Cain clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wasn't ready to admit the truth, not even to himself. But deep down he knew the blood moon was coming, and with it, a choice that would define everything: his bond with Arden, the fate of his pack, and the shadow that loomed over them all. Chapter 7. The Silverfang Council Hall was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The elders sat around the weathered table, their voices a cacophony of accusations and doubts. The torches lining the walls flickered and sputtered, their flames dancing with the tension that filled the room. Kane Thornriver stood at the head of the table, his gray eyes scanning the room, sharp and unyielding. But even he couldn't ignore the growing fractures in his pack. Ronan's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "You can't keep ignoring the signs, Kane. The pack is divided, the curse is growing stronger, and the rogues are at our borders. How long are you going to pretend this isn't falling apart?" Kane's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Arden Mistvale stepped forward. "Blaming each other won't stop the curse or the rogues," she said, her voice firm. "We need to stand together, or we're handing Arya exactly what she wants." Ronan sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "And what do you know about what Arya wants, healer? You've brought nothing but division since the day you arrived." The room erupted into shouts, the pack tearing itself apart with words. Kane slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating through the hall. "Enough," he barked, his voice silencing the chaos. But before he could regain control, the doors to the hall burst open. A rogue wolf stepped into the hall, his fur matted and his eyes wild. He snarled as he addressed the room. "Alpha Arya sends her regards." Before anyone could react, the rogue army poured in behind him, their movements calculated and deadly. The Silver Fang warriors sprang into action, but the rogues were prepared. The battle erupted with a ferocity that shook the hall, the clash of claws and teeth filling the air. Kane's focus snapped to the fight, his instincts kicking in. He tore through the first rogue that came at him, his claws slicing cleanly through fur and flesh. But the sheer number of rogues was overwhelming, and it became clear that this wasn't just an ambush, it was a coup. Arya stepped into the hall, her golden eyes gleaming with triumph. She stood tall, her presence commanding even amid the chaos. "Thornriver," she called out, her voice carrying over the noise. "You've held this pack together with nothing but stubbornness and denial. It's time for a real alpha to take over." Kane growled low in his throat, his body coiled like a spring. "You'll regret stepping foot on my land, Arya," she smirked. "Oh, I don't think I will." Amid the chaos, Arden fought alongside the warriors, her hands glowing faintly with the Moon Queen's power. She struck down one rogue, then another, her movements quick and precise. But her focus was split, her eyes constantly darting to Kane as he clashed with Arya. She didn't see the trap until it was too late. A group of rogues surrounded her, their movements coordinated. One lunged for her, and as she dodged, another struck from behind, knocking her off balance. Arden hit the ground hard, her head spinning as the rogues closed in. "Arden." Kane's voice cut through the noise, his tone filled with a rare desperation. She tried to fight back, her powers flaring briefly, but the rogues were relentless. They bound her hands with chains that seemed to sap her strength, their cold metal biting into her skin. Arya turned her gaze to Arden, a cruel smile curling her lips. "Take her to the Moonspire Temple," she ordered. "The blood moon rises tonight, and she has a role to play." Kane lunged toward Arden, his claws tearing through anyone in his path. But the rogues dragged her out of the hall before he could reach her. With Arden gone, the Silver Fang warriors faltered. The unity that had held them together was unraveling, and the rogues capitalized on the confusion. Kane's roar echoed through the hall as he fought his way to the center of the room, his eyes wild with fury. "Hold your ground," he commanded, his voice breaking through the noise. But the pack was divided, some turning on each other in the confusion, others retreating in fear. Arya's laughter rang out as she watched the chaos unfold. "You've already lost, Thornriver," she said, her tone mocking. "The blood moon belongs to me." Kane snarled, his muscles taut as he prepared to lunge at her again. But before he could move, she disappeared into the shadows, her rogues following her lead. When the battle finally ended, the council hall was in shambles. The floor was slick with blood, the walls marred with deep gashes. Kane stood in the center of the room, his breathing heavy, his hands clenched into fists. Ronan approached him, his expression grim. "She has Arden," he said quietly. Kane's gray eyes burned with anger as he turned to Ronan. "And I'll get her back." "The pack is fractured," Ronan said, his tone cautious. You can't lead them into another fight like this." Kane's voice was low, but it carried the weight of his resolve. "I don't care how fractured we are. If Arya thinks she can take what's mine, she's about to learn just how wrong she is." As the moon rose higher in the sky, its light bleeding red across the territory, Kane stood at the edge of the hall, his gaze fixed on the distant silhouette of the Moonspire Temple. The blood moon was coming, and with it, the battle that would decide everything. Would you like to expand on the dynamics between Kane and the pack, or focus on Arden's journey as a captive in the next scene? The council hall was eerily quiet now, the blood and sweat of battle lingering in the air. The torches along the walls burned low, casting faint flickers of light across the devastation. Kane Thornriver stood in the center of the room, his shoulders squared, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. Around him, what remained of his council looked battered, defeated, but none of them looked as broken as Kane felt. Arden was gone. The thought burned in his chest like an ember that refused to die. She'd been taken, dragged off by Arya's rogues, and he hadn't been able to stop it. He clenched his jaw, fighting against the tide of emotions rising in him: anger, guilt, fear. None of them had a place here, not now. Kane. Ronan's voice broke through the haze. The Beta stood across from him, his face bruised, his tone cautious. "We need to focus on the pack. The rogues might regroup and strike again. If we don't secure our borders, they'll finish what they started." Kane turned to him, his gray eyes cold and sharp. "You think I don't know that?" he growled. Ronan flinched but held his ground. "I'm just saying Arden's a healer. She knew the risks when she came here. If we waste time chasing her, the pack will fall apart." The words hit Kane like a blow, his chest tightening as the weight of Ronan's argument pressed down on him. He looked around the room, at the warriors who'd fought beside him, at the blood-streaked faces of his pack. They were tired, afraid, their trust in him hanging by a thread. Ronan wasn't wrong. The pack needed him. They were vulnerable, teetering on the edge of collapse. Every instinct as an alpha told him to stay, to regroup, to protect what was left of his people. But then he thought of Arden, her fiery defiance, her quiet strength, the way she'd looked at him as she was dragged away. He thought of Solara's warnings, of the prophecy, of the bond he'd spent so long denying. And in that moment, Kane knew there was no choice at all. He straightened, his voice steady and commanding. "We're going after her." The room erupted into protests. "We can't leave the pack undefended. It's too risky. What if it's a trap?" Kane raised a hand, silencing them. His gray eyes burned with a fire they hadn't seen in years. "Arden isn't just a healer," he said, his voice low but carrying. "She's the key to everything. The bond, the curse, the pack's survival, it all ties back to her. If we let Arya use her, we lose everything." His gaze swept the room, daring anyone to challenge him. "I'll go alone if I have to. But if you trust me, if you trust this pack, you'll stand with me." For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was suffocating, the weight of Kane's words pressing down on everyone. And then, one by one, the warriors began to nod. "We'll follow you, Alpha," one said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his eyes. Kane turned to Ronan, his gaze hard. "Secure the borders. Hold the pack together. If anything happens while we're gone, it's on you." Ronan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You're making a mistake." Kane's voice dropped, low and dangerous. "No. The mistake would be letting her die." Within the hour, the warriors were ready. Kane stood at the front of the group, his presence commanding despite the weight on his shoulders. The moonlight painted him in silver, the faint glow making his gray eyes look almost otherworldly. He looked over his pack, his warriors, his family. "This isn't just about Arden," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "It's about the pack, about who we are and what we stand for. We don't leave our own behind. Not now, not ever." The warriors howled in response, their voices echoing into the night. As they set out toward the Moonspire Temple, Kane felt a strange sense of clarity. The bond he'd spent so long fighting felt less like a chain and more like a thread, something fragile but unbreakable. He didn't know what waited for them at the temple, whether they'd find Arden alive, or if they were walking into a trap, but for the first time in a long time, he felt sure of one thing. He wasn't running from the bond anymore. He was running toward it, and he would fight for it, no matter the cost. The Moonspire Temple loomed in the distance, bathed in the blood-red light of the rising moon. Its jagged spires pierced the sky, ancient carvings glowing faintly with an unnatural energy. The air was thick, charged with tension and the metallic scent of coming violence. Cain Thornriver led the Silverfang warriors through the dense forest surrounding the temple, his gray eyes locked on their destination. "Keep your movements sharp and quiet," he growled under his breath. "They'll be expecting us." Behind him, the pack moved as one, their breaths quiet, but their resolve unshaken. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a fight for survival. And Cain could feel the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders like a vice. They were nearly at the temple's clearing when the first attack came. Rogues burst from the shadows, snarling and slashing, their movements calculated and precise. Cain didn't hesitate. He lunged at the nearest attacker, his claws slicing cleanly through fur and flesh. "Push forward," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Get to the temple." The Silverfang warriors fought with precision, their claws and teeth gleaming under the moonlight. But the rogues were relentless, their numbers seeming to grow with every moment. The air was filled with the sounds of growls, snapping jaws, and the clash of bodies. Cain tore through another rogue, his gaze snapping to the temple entrance. "We don't stop until we get Arden." The interior of the Moonspire was a twisted reflection of its former grandeur. The carvings on the walls pulsed with an ominous red light, and the air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the temple itself was alive. Arden was bound at the center of the main chamber, her hands chained to the ancient altar. Arya stood over her, her golden eyes gleaming with triumph. "You're too late, Thornriver," Arya sneered as Cain and the warriors stormed into the chamber. "The Shadow Wolf is already awakening." Arden's green eyes locked onto Cain's, relief flashing across her face, despite the chains that bound her. "Cain," she whispered, her voice a mix of hope and warning. Cain's gaze snapped to Arya, his body coiling like a spring. "Let her go, Arya. This ends now." Arya laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Oh, it's just beginning." Before Cain could move, the ground beneath them trembled. The carvings on the walls flared brighter, and the oppressive weight in the air grew suffocating. A low growl echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant, sending shivers down everyone's spines. From the shadows, a massive form began to emerge, a wolf made of smoke and shadow, its eyes glowing with an unholy silver light. The Shadow Wolf had arrived. The warriors faltered, their instincts screaming at them to run. But Cain stepped forward, his body tense but unyielding. "Stay focused," he barked. "We don't stop until it's over." The Shadow Wolf let out a bone-rattling howl, its voice filled with malice and power. It turned its glowing eyes on Cain, a sinister grin curling its ethereal lips. "Alpha Thornriver," it purred, its voice a haunting echo. "You've come to face your fate?" As the battle erupted around her, Arden closed her eyes, focusing on the mark on her palm. She could feel the Moon Queen's energy pulsing within her, faint but steady. She whispered an ancient incantation under her breath, and the chains around her wrists began to heat, glowing faintly with silver light. Arya noticed and lunged toward her, but Arden moved faster. With a final surge of power, the chains shattered and Arden sprang to her feet. Arya snarled, her claws slashing toward Arden, but Arden raised her hands, a burst of light emanating from her palms. The force threw Arya back, slamming her into the far wall. The Moon Queen's voice echoed in Arden's mind. "Stand strong, child. The Shadow Wolf feeds on fear. Show it your resolve." Cain was locked in combat with the Shadow Wolf, his claws swiping through its smoky form to no avail. The creature laughed, its voice grating. "You can't destroy me, Thornriver. I am born of your blood, your denial, your fear. And now I will consume you." Arden stepped forward, her hands glowing with silver light. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "You're not unstoppable." The shadow wolf turned to her, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You think you can challenge me, little healer? You are nothing without him." Arden's voice didn't waver. "I don't need to defeat you. I just need to weaken you." She raised her hands, the light from her palms intensifying. The shadow wolf howled in anger as its form began to flicker, its edges growing less defined. The shadow wolf turned to Cain, its voice a venomous snarl. "The curse can only be broken through an act of selfless love, Alpha. Are you prepared to pay the price?" Cain didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his gray eyes locked on the creature. "If it means saving her in the pack, I'll do whatever it takes." The shadow wolf grinned, its form solidifying slightly. "Then sacrifice your alpha powers. Give them to me, and I will release her." Arden's voice cut through the tension. "No, Cain, you don't have to do this." Cain turned to her, his expression softening. "It's the only way, Arden. The pack needs you more than it needs me." He stepped closer to the shadow wolf, his body tense but his resolve unwavering. "Take them," he said, his voice steady. The chamber was filled with a blinding light as the shadow wolf lunged toward Cain, its smoky form wrapping around him. Arden screamed his name, but the sound was drowned out by the creature's roar. When the light faded, the shadow wolf was gone, and Cain stood in the center of the chamber, his body trembling but his eyes still burning with determination. The curse had shifted, the balance had changed, but the fight was far from over. Arden stepped toward him, her voice a whisper. "Cain, what did you do?" He turned to her, his expression softer now. "I did what I had to." Outside, the blood moon hung heavy in the sky, its light a reminder that the battle wasn't finished, and neither was their story. Chapter 8. The Moonspire Temple was deathly quiet, its ancient carvings dimmed as if the stones themselves were holding their breath. The blood moon hung heavy in the sky, its crimson light spilling through the shattered roof and painting the chamber in shades of red. The silence was deafening after the chaos of the battle, but Cain Thornriver stood at the center of it all, his body battered but unbroken, his gray eyes locked on the shadowy remnants of the shadow wolf swirling before him. Arden Mistvale was at his side, her breathing shallow, her green eyes glowing faintly with the Moon Queen's power. She looked at Cain, her voice a whisper but steady. "You don't have to do this." Cain turned to her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "I do," he said quietly. "For you, for the pack, for all of us." The shadow wolf reformed slightly, its smoky edges coalescing into a sharper, more menacing shape. "Words mean nothing, Thornriver," it growled, its voice reverberating through the chamber like a storm. "Prove your love, prove your worth, or watch everything burn." Cain stepped forward, his shoulders squared despite the weight pressing down on him. He could feel the pack's eyes on him, those who had followed him here, who had fought and bled for him. But all of that seemed distant now. All that mattered was the woman standing behind him and the choice he was about to make. He clenched his fists, then relaxed them, turning his gaze to the glowing mark on Arden's palm. It shimmered faintly, a reminder of everything they'd endured. He took a deep breath, then looked up toward the moonlight, filtering through the temple's ruins. "I offer it all," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "My power, my title, my pride. Take it. Take everything but spare her. Spare my pack." The shadow wolf snarled, its form flickering as though it was feeding on his words. "Do you understand what you're giving up, Alpha?" Cain's lips twitched into a faint, rueful smile. "For the first time, I think I do." The air shifted. The oppressive weight grew heavier, the carvings on the walls glowing faintly as the Moon Queen's presence filled the room. The faint outline of her form appeared a shimmering, celestial figure with eyes like twin moons. Her voice was calm, almost sorrowful. "You understand the price, Cain Thornriver?" He nodded. "I do." The Moon Queen turned her gaze to Arden, who stepped forward despite the trembling in her legs. Arden placed her hand over Cain's, her green eyes locked on his. We do this together, she said firmly. Kane's brow furrowed. Arden, you don't. I do, she interrupted, her voice unwavering. I choose you, Kane. Not the Moon Queen, not the bond. You. And if that means giving up my connection to her, then so be it. The Moon Queen's expression didn't change, but there was a faint flicker of something in her eyes, approval, perhaps, or understanding. So be it, she said. The carvings on the walls flared to life, the light spreading throughout the chamber. The shadow wolf howled, its form twisting and writhing as the power of the Moon Queen surged through it. Arden closed her eyes, her hand tightening around Kane's as she felt the connection to the Moon Queen begin to sever. It was like losing a part of herself, a piece of her soul she hadn't realized was so deeply embedded. Kane felt the shift too. The strength that had defined him as Alpha began to ebb away, replaced by something quieter, but no less powerful. The shadow wolf let out one final, bone-rattling howl before it dissolved into the air, its smoky form dispersing like mist in the wind. The oppressive weight lifted, the carvings dimming as the blood moon's light began to fade. Kane staggered slightly but didn't let go of Arden's hand. He turned to her, his gray eyes searching hers. Are you okay? She nodded, though tears shimmered in her eyes. Are you? Kane's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. I don't know, but I think I will be. The Moon Queen's form flickered, her voice echoing softly. The curse is broken, but the road ahead will not be easy. Love is its own trial, and you have both chosen it. Walk it wisely. And then she was gone, leaving them standing in the silence of the temple, the faint glow of dawn creeping in through the broken walls. The pack gathered outside the temple, their eyes wide with awe and confusion as they saw Kane and Arden emerge. Kane's presence was different now, less commanding, more human, but the respect in their gazes didn't waver. What happens now? One of the warriors asked, his voice hesitant. Kane glanced at Arden, then back at the pack. We rebuild, he said simply. Together. Arden stepped closer to him, her hand brushing his. And we move forward. Without the curse, without the bond forcing us together. Just us. Kane nodded, the weight of everything settling over him like a cloak. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like hope. The silver-famed territory felt different in the light of a new dawn. The heavy, oppressive air that had lingered for generations was gone, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. The pack gathered in the clearing near the Alpha's keep, their faces a mix of curiosity and trepidation. The old symbols of unity, ceremonial banners. The Alpha's crest seemed brighter, their colors more vivid against the backdrop of the forest. Kane Thornriver stood at the center of it all, his presence no longer towering but grounded, steady. He had shed the mantle of an untouchable Alpha, and in its place was something more human, more real. His gray eyes swept over the wolves, their gazes fixed on him, with a quiet reverence that wasn't born of fear but respect. Beside him stood Arden Mistvale, her green eyes alight with resolve. The healer who had once been an outsider now stood as a symbol of hope. The faint glow of the Moon Queen's mark on her palm had faded, but her presence carried an undeniable strength. Kane stepped forward, his voice steady but quiet enough to demand silence. The curse is broken, he began, the words simple but heavy with meaning. For generations, it's been a shadow over this pack, dividing us, weakening us. No more. The pack murmured softly, the tension in the crowd easing. It's not just the curse that's gone, Kane continued, his gaze moving from wolf to wolf. The way we led, the way we ruled, the way we treated each other, it ends now. We move forward together, not because of fear or duty, but because that's what this pack deserves. His eyes landed on Ronan, who stood near the edge of the crowd. The Betta's face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, respect, maybe, or guilt. And if anyone questions that, Kane added, his voice hardening, they can take it up with me. Arden stepped forward, her voice softer but no less commanding. This isn't just Kane's pack, she said. It's ours. all of ours. The bond that saved us wasn't just between the two of us, it was the bond we shared with all of you. If we're going to rebuild, it has to be together." She paused, her gaze meeting each wolf's. "I came here as an outsider. I didn't ask for this, and neither did Cain. But we chose it. And now we're asking you to choose too. Choose to trust, to heal, to grow." The pack was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over them. Then, one by one, they began to nod. Ash, the young warrior who had once doubted Arden, stepped forward. He dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "For the Silverfang pack," he said, his voice steady. The gesture spread like wildfire. The other wolves followed, kneeling before Cain and Arden, their heads bowed in a silent promise. Cain's throat tightened, but he didn't let it show. "Stand," he said, his voice carrying over the clearing. "We don't kneel to each other anymore. We stand together." The wolves rose, their eyes alight with something that hadn't been there before. Trust. Trust. The pack spent the rest of the day working side by side, clearing the rubble from the battle, repairing the damage to the keep. Warriors who had once been at odds with each other shared tools and stories, their laughter ringing through the trees. Cain watched it all from the steps of the keep, his arms crossed over his chest. Arden joined him, her hands dusted with dirt from tending to the wounded. "You're staring," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Just making sure it's real," Cain replied, his voice low. She nudged him lightly. "It is." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the territory in shades of gold and amber, Cain and Arden stood on the edge of the clearing, looking out at their pack. "They're different," Arden said softly. Cain nodded. "They're free. And you?" she asked, her gaze shifting to him. He glanced at her, his gray eyes softening. Still figuring that out. Arden reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his. "You don't have to figure it out alone." For the first time in what felt like forever, Cain allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "I know." The pack's howls rose in the distance, a sound of unity, of hope. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a duty or an expectation. It felt like home. The wind at the howling cliffs was sharp, crisp, and cool, carrying with it the salt of the nearby sea and the faint, wild scent of the forest below. Cane Thorn River stood near the edge of the jagged precipice, his hands resting on the stone ledge, his gray eyes fixed on the moon rising slowly over the horizon. Its silver light bathed the cliffs in a soft glow, the shadows long and peaceful. Behind him, Arden Mistvale stepped lightly over the uneven rocks, her green eyes bright in the moonlight. She wrapped her shawl tighter against the wind, her hair tousled by its playful gusts. She paused a few paces behind Cain, watching him in silence for a moment. "You look like a man carrying a secret," she said, her voice soft but teasing. Cain turned his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "If I was, would you be able to tell?" Arden stepped closer, leaning on the ledge beside him. "I'd probably let you keep it. For a little while." They stood together in companionable silence, the moon climbing higher, casting its reflection on the distant waves. The air between them was light, but charged with unspoken thoughts. Arden finally broke the silence, her voice quieter now. "Do you think they'll ever truly understand?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the forest below, where the soft glow of the pack's fires dotted the darkness. What it took to get here. Cain was quiet for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for the right words. "Maybe they don't have to," he said finally. "Maybe it's enough that they're safe, that they have a chance to build something better." Arden nodded, though her expression remained pensive. "Sometimes I think about Solara, about what she gave up, how much pain she carried. And yet somehow we're standing here because of her." Cain's voice softened. "She didn't have the choice we did, but she gave us the chance to make one. That's more than most would have done." Arden tilted her head back, her eyes tracing the constellations. "Do you ever think about how different it could have been? If the curse had never existed, If we weren't this? Cain let out a low chuckle, the sound warm and rare. You mean if I wasn't a stubborn, cursed alpha who didn't know what he had, until it was almost too late? Arden laughed softly, her voice carried away by the wind. I think the curse just brought out the best and worst in both of us. He turned to her then, his gaze steady. It showed me what mattered. That's enough for me. Arden reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. For me too. She glanced back at the moon, its glow reflecting in her eyes. The curse is broken, she said softly, almost to herself. And our fairy tale life is just beginning. They stood together, watching the moonlight stretch over the cliffs and the forest beyond. The pack's distant howls rose through the night, a song of unity and freedom that echoed across the landscape. Cain squeezed Arden's hand gently, his voice low. It's not going to be perfect, you know. Fairy tales never are. Arden smiled, leaning into his side. I don't need perfect. I just need us. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head, the rare gesture filled with a quiet intensity. Together, they looked out over the world they'd fought to rebuild, the weight of their past now a memory, and the promise of tomorrow stretching before them. The wind howled once more, carrying their story into the night, a tale of curses broken, bonds forged, and love that refused to be denied.